The day her brother sold her to a stranger, Alara Quinn made a decision that would change everything. In a dusty parlor that smelled of old cigars and broken promises, 23-year-old Alara stood frozen while two men negotiated her future like she was livestock. Her own brother, desperate and drunk, traded her away to settle his debts, shipped her off to a frontier ranch owned by a man whose face she'd never seen. They called it arrangement. She called it what it was, disposal. But as that stagecoach rattled west toward Red Hollow, something hardened inside her chest. If they wanted her gone, fine. She'd disappear, but she'd do it on her terms. If you want to see how Alara transforms from unwanted burden to unstoppable force, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wheels hit another rut, and Alara's head cracked against the stagecoach window hard enough to see stars. She didn't bother straightening up. What was the point? 3 days of this, dust, heat, and the growing certainty that she was riding toward the edge of the known world with no way back. Across from her, a traveling salesman with a waxed mustache had been trying to make conversation since they'd left St. Louis. She'd ignored every attempt. Shame about the drought, he tried again, mopping his forehead. Heard it's worse out west. Makes a man wonder why anyone would stake a claim in such unforgiving country. Alara kept her eyes on the landscape rolling past. Brown grass, scattered sage, sky so big it made her feel like she might fall right into it. You visiting family? The man pressed. No. Business, then? Something like that. He waited for elaboration that never came, then finally gave up with a theatrical sigh. The other passenger, an older woman in a severe black dress, hadn't spoken a word the entire journey, which suited Alara fine. Silence was better than pity, and pity was all she'd known for 23 years. She touched the bruise on her cheek without meaning to. 4 days old now, fading from purple to that ugly greenish yellow. Her brother Tobias had been drunk when he'd done it. Not that sobriety had ever made him gentle. The blow itself hadn't surprised her. What came after did. I found a solution, he'd said, pacing their cramped Boston apartment like a caged animal. A way out for both of us. The solution turns out to be a man named Colt Mercer, who owned a cattle ranch somewhere in the Montana territory. Tobias had lost money to him in a card game, a staggering amount apparently, and couldn't pay. So they'd made another kind of deal. He needs help running the place, Tobias had explained, not quite meeting her eyes. Domestic work, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. It's respectable. You sold me to cover your gambling debt. I'm giving you an opportunity. Christ, Alara, you think you have prospects here? You think anyone in this city is lining up to marry a woman who looks like... He'd stopped himself, but the damage was done. It always was. The truth was, Tobias wasn't entirely wrong. Their parents had died 6 years ago. Fever took them both within a week of each other and left Alara in her brother's care. At 17, she'd been awkward and plain, but at least invisible. By 23, plain had curdled into something worse. The kind of face people looked away from at church socials. The kind that made marriage proposals non-existent and job prospects scarce. She'd worked as a seamstress for a while, taking in mending from the women who whispered about her in the same breath they handed over their torn hems. Then the shop owner's wife decided Alara's presence was unsettling to customers, and that was that. Tobias had kept her on out of obligation, she supposed, but obligation had limits, especially when you drank away your wages and owed money to dangerous men. So here she was, rattling toward Montana with a small trunk containing everything she owned, 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a few books, and the kind of resignation that settles into your bones when you realize you've never had choices, only assignments. The stagecoach lurched to a stop at a way station just as the sun started its descent toward the horizon. The driver, a grizzled man who looked like he'd been carved from the same leather as his reins, climbed down with audible relief. Our stop, he announced. Get food if you want it. We roll at sundown. The salesman practically fell out of the coach in his eagerness to stretch his legs. The woman in black departed with silent dignity. Alara waited until they'd both gone before climbing down herself, moving carefully because her legs had gone numb from sitting. The way station was barely more than a shack with delusions of grandeur. A sagging porch, windows that looked like they'd been cleaned sometime during the previous administration. a hand-painted sign that read "Food" in letters that had mostly flaked away. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fried meat and unwashed bodies. A few rough-looking men sat at tables shoveling food into their mouths like they were in a race. The woman in black had claimed a corner table and was eating something brown and unidentifiable with the grim determination of someone who knew better than to ask questions about the menu. Elara approached what passed for a counter. Behind it stood a woman who might have been anywhere between 40 and 60, with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. "What'll it be?" the woman asked without looking up from the pot she was stirring. "Just coffee, please." "Coffee's 2 cents. Stew's a nickel." Elara counted out coins from the small purse Tobias had given her. Traveling money, he'd called it, though it was barely enough to cover meals for the journey. She took the coffee to an empty table as far from the other patrons as possible and wrapped her hands around the tin cup, grateful for the warmth even though the evening was still hot. She was halfway through the bitter, overboiled brew when someone sat down across from her. "You're the one heading to Red Hollow." It wasn't a question. Elara looked up to find a man studying her with undisguised curiosity. He was young, maybe 30, with sun-damaged skin and the kind of lean build that came from hard work rather than hunger. "How did you know that?" "Because Red Hollow is the last stop on this route, and I've never seen you before." He stuck out a calloused hand. "Tom Brennan. I work one of the neighboring spreads." Elara hesitated, then shook his hand briefly. "Elara Quinn. You're Mercer's new housekeeper, then." Word traveled fast out here, apparently. "Yes." Tom let out a low whistle. "Good luck with that. Colt's not exactly known for his sparkling conversation." "I'm not being hired for conversation." "True enough." He leaned back in his chair, still watching her with that open curiosity that made her want to shrink into her dress. "Fair warning, though, Red Hollow isn't like the places you're probably used to. It's hard country, makes people hard right along with it." "I'll manage." "Sure you will." He didn't sound convinced. "Just, look, Colt's a fair man, rough as a cob and about as warm as January, but fair. You do the work, he won't give you trouble." Elara took another sip of coffee to avoid responding. She wasn't interested in character assessments of her new employer. Fair, unfair, it didn't matter. She'd survived Tobias. She could survive anyone. Tom seemed to sense he was being dismissed. He stood, tipping his hat. "Well, welcome to the territory, Miss Quinn. Hope you find what you're looking for out here." What she was looking for, as if she'd had any choice in the matter. The rest of the stop passed in blessed silence. Elara finished her coffee, used the primitive outhouse behind the station, and climbed back into the stagecoach just as the sun touched the western hills. The landscape had changed subtly over the past few hours, more rugged now, with outcroppings of rock breaking through the prairie grass like bones through skin. The salesman had apparently found whiskey at the way station. He dozed against the window, snoring softly. The woman in black resumed her position across from Elara, hands folded in her lap, face revealing nothing. Night fell fast out here. One moment the sky was streaked with orange and purple. The next it was black velvet scattered with more stars than Elara had ever seen in her life. No city lights to wash them out, no buildings to block the view. Just infinite darkness and infinite sky. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, the driver was shouting, and the coach was slowing to a stop. "Red Hollow! End of the line!" Elara's heart jumped into her throat. She peered out the window but couldn't see much beyond the pools of lantern light. A few buildings, dark and angular against the night sky. The skeletal outline of what might have been a windmill. The salesman startled awake, looked around in confusion, then settled back down when he realized this wasn't his stop. The woman in black gathered her bags and departed without a word, swallowed immediately by the darkness. "You getting out or not?" the driver called. Elara forced herself to move. Her trunk was already on the ground by the time she climbed down, her legs shaky after so many hours of travel. The air smelled different here, sage and dust and something else she couldn't name. Wood smoke, maybe. "Someone meeting you?" the driver asked, not unkindly. "I assume so." "Well, you can wait inside the station if not." He gestured toward a building with light glowing in the windows. "Careful now." Then he was gone, the stagecoach rattling away into the night, and Elara was alone. Not entirely alone, she realized. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the station house and walked toward her. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of economy that suggested every step was calculated. Elara Quinn? The voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting over wind and cattle. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. Just flat. Yes. He stepped into the light, and Elara got her first look at Colt Mercer. He wasn't what she'd expected, though she realized she hadn't really known what to expect. Mid-30s, maybe. Hard-featured in a way that suggested life had beaten any softness out of him years ago. Dark hair that needed cutting, eyes that were difficult to read in the lamplight. He was looking at her with the same dispassionate assessment you'd give a horse you were considering buying. "You're younger than I thought you'd be," he said finally. "I'm 23. He picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing. "Wagon's this way. We've got about an hour's ride to the ranch." He started walking without checking to see if she was following. Elara grabbed her skirts and hurried after him, irritation sparking through her exhaustion. No greeting, no welcome, just orders. The wagon was a utilitarian thing. Rough wood, no cushioning, pulled by two horses that looked half asleep. Colt threw her trunk in the back with a thud, then climbed up onto the driver's seat. He didn't offer to help her up. Elara managed it herself, though not gracefully. She'd barely settled onto the hard bench when Colt clicked his tongue and the horses started moving. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The wagon rattled along a road that was barely more than 2 ruts worn into the prairie. Darkness pressed in on all sides, broken only by starlight and the faint glow of the lantern swinging from a hook on the wagon's side. "Your brother told you what this job entails?" Colt asked abruptly. "Housekeeping, cooking, general domestic work. That's the polite version. Real version is, the ranch house is a disaster because I can't keep help, and I don't have time to deal with it myself. You'll cook 3 meals a day for me and whatever hands I've got working. You'll keep the house clean and the clothes mended. You'll handle the chickens and the kitchen garden if you can keep anything alive in this heat. In exchange, you get room, board, and $20 a month. $20. It was more than she'd made as a seamstress, but then again, this sounded like twice the work. "That's acceptable," she said. "Good. Because out here, acceptable is the best you're going to get." He glanced at her sideways. "You look like you've got questions." She had dozens. Instead, she asked the safest one. "How many ranch hands?" "Right now, 3. Used to be more, but—" He trailed off. "Doesn't matter. 3 for now." "Will they be living in the house?" "No. There's a bunkhouse. You won't have to worry about them except for meals." Small mercies. "What happened to your previous housekeeper?" "Left. They all do eventually. Can't handle the isolation." There was no emotion in his voice when he said it, just stating facts. "I see. Do you?" He looked at her again, longer this time. "Red Hollow is 15 miles from the nearest town. That town has 200 people on a good day. There's no church socials out here, Miss Quinn. No tea parties. No opportunities to socialize with other women because there aren't any other women within riding distance. It's work, sleep, and more work. Some people can't take that." "I'm not some people." It came out sharper than she'd intended. Colt raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. They rode in silence for a while longer. Elara's eyes had adjusted enough to make out shapes in the darkness. Rolling hills, the occasional stand of trees, what might have been a creek bed cutting across the landscape. The air was cooler now, almost pleasant. "There are rules," Colt said eventually. "Not many, but they're not negotiable." "All right. First, I don't tolerate theft. You take something that's not yours, you're done. Second, you keep your room locked at night. I don't expect trouble from my hands, but better safe than sorry. Third, if something breaks or runs out, you tell me immediately. I can't fix what I don't know about." That seems reasonable. "And fourth—" He paused, seeming to consider his words. "I'm not a talker, Miss Quinn. I don't need conversation with my meals or company in the evenings. I need competence. You do your job, I'll do mine, and we'll get along fine. Understood?" "Perfectly." "Good. Because the last thing I need is complications." The way he said it, like she was already a complication just by existing, made something tighten in Elara's chest. But what had she expected? Warmth? Gratitude? She was here because her brother owed this man money, and she was the payment. That wasn't the foundation for anything resembling kindness. The ranch buildings materialized out of the darkness like ships emerging from fog. The main house was bigger than Alara had anticipated. 2 stories, wood frame construction, with a porch that wrapped around at least 2 sides. Even in the dim light from Colt's lantern, she could see it needed work. Peeling paint, sagging steps, shutters hanging at odd angles. Behind the house stood a barn, dark and silent. Beyond that, what must have been the bunkhouse, a smaller structure with a single window glowing yellow. Colt pulled the wagon up to the main house and set the brake. "I'll show you your room, then you're on your own until morning. Breakfast is at 5:30. 5:30, Alara repeated faintly. Sunrise is around 6 this time of year. The hands start work at dawn, which means they need to eat before that. He grabbed her trunk again. You got a problem with early mornings? No? Good. The front door wasn't locked. Colt pushed it open and held the lantern high, illuminating a front room that made Alara's heart sink. It wasn't just messy, it was archaeological. Layers of neglect built up over what must have been months, maybe years. Dust coated every surface. Dishes were piled in a dry sink. Mud had been tracked across the floor and left to cake into patterns. The whole place smelled like old smoke and male sweat and despair. I told you it was a disaster, Colt said, watching her face. You understated it. Yeah, well. He moved through the front room toward a narrow staircase. Your room's upstairs. There are 3 bedrooms. Mine's the one at the end of the hall. You can have either of the others. They're both equally awful. The stairs creaked under their weight. Upstairs was marginally better, less accumulated filth at least. Colt pushed open the door to a small room that held a narrow bed, a battered dresser, and a window that looked out over darkness. He set her trunk at the foot of the bed. Linens are in the dresser. Should be clean, I think. If not, there's more in the cupboard downstairs. Thank you. He nodded toward the other end of the hall. Washroom's that way. Water has to be pumped and heated on the stove. Outhouse is behind the kitchen if you need it during the night, but I'd recommend using the chamber pot. We get coyotes sometimes. Coyotes? Of course. Colt moved toward the door, then stopped. Look, Miss Quinn, I don't know what your brother told you about this arrangement, and I don't particularly care, but I'll be straight with you. This isn't going to be easy. The work is hard, the conditions are rough, and I'm not going to hold your hand through it. If you can't handle that, say so now and I'll drive you back to town in the morning. Alara met his eyes. I can handle it. We'll see. Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs, and Alara was alone in a dark room in a house that smelled like abandonment, 15 miles from the nearest human settlement, with 5:30 breakfast looming like a threat. She sat down on the bed. It was harder than it looked, and let herself acknowledge the fear she'd been pushing down for 3 days. This was real. She was really here, and there was no going back. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped, then stood and opened her trunk. The room was too dark to properly unpack, but she found her nightgown by feel and changed out of her travel-stained dress. The sheets in the dresser were clean enough, or at least they didn't smell actively bad. She made the bed with practiced efficiency, trying not to think about what might be crawling in the mattress. Through the window, she could see the bunkhouse light had gone out. The hands must have turned in for the night. Somewhere in the distance, an animal made a sound, high and yipping. Coyotes, probably. Alara lay down on the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling she couldn't see. Tomorrow, she would tackle the house. She would learn to cook for ranch hands. She would figure out how to operate a pump and manage chickens and survive in this alien landscape. Tonight, she let herself feel the full weight of how alone she was. And in the morning, when gray light started seeping through the dusty window, she got up and went to work. The kitchen was worse than the front room. Alara stood in the doorway, surveying the damage with a sense of grim determination. The cast-iron stove looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Grease coated everything within 3 feet of it. The dry sink was piled with dishes that had apparently been used, rinsed half-heartedly, and then abandoned. A pot on the stove contained something that might have been stew once but had since evolved into its own ecosystem. 5:30. She'd woken at 4:30 to give herself time to figure out where things were, and she was starting to think even that wasn't enough time. But she'd survived worse than a dirty kitchen. Tobias had made sure of that. She found an apron hanging on a hook, stiff with old flour and God knew what else, and tied it around her waist. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. First, fire. She'd watched her mother manage a cast iron stove for years. The principles were the same, even if this one looked like it was held together by rust and stubbornness. She cleared out yesterday's ashes, found wood stacked near the back door, and got a small fire going. It took 3 tries and all her patience, but eventually flames caught and held. Second, water. The pump was outside, which meant hauling buckets. The well was deeper than she'd expected, and the pump handle fought her on every stroke, but she managed to fill 3 buckets and lug them back to the kitchen. Third, coffee. She found grounds in a tin that had seen better days and dumped a generous amount into the pot. It would be strong enough to strip paint, but she had a feeling that's how ranch hands liked it. By the time the coffee was boiling and she'd managed to fry up half a dozen eggs and most of a slab of bacon, it was 5:20. The back door opened and 3 men filed in, bringing the smell of horses and hay with them. They stopped when they saw her, surprise evident on all 3 faces. "Morning," said the oldest of them, probably in his 50s, with gray stubble and eyes that had seen everything twice. "You must be the new housekeeper." "Elara Quinn." She wiped her hands on the apron. "Breakfast is almost ready." "Well, ain't that a welcome change?" He took a seat at the rough wooden table that dominated the kitchen. "Name's Jack. This here's Marcus and young Pete." Marcus nodded, a man of maybe 40 with dark skin and a reserved expression. Pete couldn't have been older than 18, all gangly limbs and nervous energy. "Ma'am," Pete said shyly. Elara distributed plates and forks, poured coffee that came out looking like crude oil, and watched as the men fell on the food like wolves. They ate in silence, focused entirely on the task at hand. She was refilling coffee cups when Colt appeared in the doorway. He looked the same as he had last night. Same hard face, same unreadable expression, but he'd shaved, and his shirt was marginally cleaner. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, then sat down at the head of the table. Elara put a plate in front of him without a word. "Thank you," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. The men finished eating and filed back out with murmured thanks. Colt remained, methodically working through his breakfast. Elara started on the dishes, pumping water into the sink and scrubbing at grease that had been baked on through repeated use. "You know how to ride?" Colt asked suddenly. She turned surprised. "A horse?" "Yes, a horse." No, not really." He finished his coffee. "You'll need to learn. Can't have you stranded here if something happens." "What kind of something?" "Any kind. Injury, fire, emergency in town." He stood, carrying his plate to the sink. "I'll teach you when there's time. For now, focus on getting this place functional." He left before she could respond. Elara spent the rest of the morning attacking the kitchen with the kind of focused fury that came from years of channeling anger into productivity. She scrubbed the stove until her arms ached. She washed every dish, glass, and piece of cutlery in the house. She swept the floor 3 times to get up all the tracked-in dirt. By noon, the kitchen looked almost civilized. She made a simple lunch, bread and cheese and leftover bacon, and left it on the table for anyone who wandered in. Then she moved to the front room and started there. Dust. So much dust. It rose in clouds as she swept, making her cough and her eyes water. She found rags and made her own cleaning solution from soap and vinegar and scrubbed every surface she could reach. The windows were so dirty she could barely see through them. Cleaning them became a revelation, letting in afternoon light that exposed even more problems. But slowly, so slowly, the house began to emerge from its cocoon of neglect. She found odd things as she cleaned. A woman's hairpin behind the settee, a child's carved toy horse on a high shelf. A daguerreotype of a young couple, formal and unsmiling, tucked into a drawer. Evidence of lives lived here before. Lives that had ended or moved on, leaving only traces. Dinner was the same as breakfast, simple, filling, designed to fuel hard work. The men ate gratefully. Colt ate in silence. When they'd all gone and she was alone with the dishes again, Elara finally let herself stop moving. Her back hurt. Her hands were raw. Every muscle in her body was screaming. But the kitchen was clean. The front room was livable, and she'd made it through day 1. She climbed the stairs to her room and collapsed onto the bed without even changing out of her dress. Through the window she could see stars. Thousands of them. Millions. In Boston, you could barely see a dozen stars on a clear night. Maybe, she thought, as sleep pulled her under, there were worse places to be exiled to. The first week passed in a blur of work. Alara fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Wake before dawn, start the fire, make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, cook breakfast for 4 men who could eat their weight in eggs and bacon, clean the kitchen, tackle another section of the house, make lunch, clean more, make dinner, clean the kitchen again, fall into bed exhausted. The house fought her every step of the way. Years of neglect didn't vanish overnight, but inch by inch, room by room, she reclaimed it. The men, Jack, Marcus, and Pete, were polite but distant. They thanked her for meals and stayed out of her way otherwise. She learned small things about them through observation. Jack had a bad knee that bothered him in the mornings. Marcus was left-handed. Pete was terrified of spiders but would never admit it. Colt remained an enigma. He was gone most days from dawn until dusk, working the ranch with a single-minded intensity that bordered on obsessive. When he was in the house, he moved through it like a ghost, silent, efficient, leaving no trace of his presence beyond dirty dishes and muddy boot prints. He didn't make small talk, didn't ask about her day, didn't comment on the gradual transformation of his home, except for one afternoon when she'd finished cleaning the front room and he'd paused in the doorway, looked around and said, "Better." That was it, just better. But she'd take it. It was on the 8th day that things shifted. She'd been working in what she'd decided was a study, a small room off the front parlor that had been buried under papers and accumulated junk. She'd spent 2 hours sorting through bills and receipts and correspondence, trying to create some kind of system. She was on her knees, reaching under a desk to retrieve a fallen ledger, when she heard boots on the porch and then raised voices. "Don't care what Henderson says, I'm not selling," Colt's voice, tight with anger. "You're being a stubborn fool, Mercer," another man's voice, older and rough. "That land's not producing. You can't make a living off half-dead cattle and pride." "I can make a living off my land just fine without selling it to speculators." "Speculators? I'm offering you a fair price. You're offering me half what it's worth, and we both know it." Alara stayed very still, barely breathing. "Your daddy built this ranch from nothing," the stranger said, his voice dropping. "You really think he'd want to see you lose it because you're too proud to accept help?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. "Get off my land, Henderson. You're making a mistake." "Then it's my mistake to make. Now get." Footsteps. A horse being mounted, hoofbeats fading into the distance. Alara waited a full minute before emerging from the study. She found Colt standing in the front room, staring at nothing, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. "Mr. Mercer?" He turned, and for just a second she saw something raw in his face. Then it was gone, locked away behind his usual mask. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to know you probably need coffee." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "That obvious? You look like you want to hit something." "I do." He ran a hand through his hair. "But coffee will work too, I suppose." She made it strong and black, the way she'd learned he preferred it. He took the cup and sat down heavily in one of the chairs she'd cleaned, staring into the dark liquid like it held answers. Alara knew she should leave, should go back to her work and pretend she hadn't heard anything. But something made her stay, hovering in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen. "The ranch is in trouble," Colt said finally. "Not a question." "Is it?" "Don't play dumb, Miss Quinn. You've been here over a week. You can't help but notice there are only 3 hands working a spread that needs a dozen. That half the buildings need repairs I can't afford. That Henderson smells blood in the water." "I've noticed you work hard," Alara said carefully. "That's all." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt pinned by the weight of his attention. "You know what's funny?" he said. "People underestimate you. I did too that first night. Thought you'd last maybe 3 days before you ran back to civilization. I had nowhere to run to. Even so," he took a long drink of coffee, "you're tougher than you look." It wasn't exactly a compliment, but coming from him it felt like one. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow you're learning to ride." She blinked. "Tomorrow? Like I said before, you need to know how to handle yourself out here. Besides, I could use help checking the fence line on the south pasture, and I can't spare one of the hands." "I don't—" "5:30, he interrupted. "Right after breakfast. Wear something you can move in." Then he stood, drained the rest of his coffee, and walked out, leaving Alara standing in the kitchen with her heart beating faster than it should have been. She was going to learn to ride. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The horse was a chestnut mare named Rosie, and she looked at Alara with what could only be described as profound skepticism. "She won't bite," Colt said, leading the horse out of the barn into the pale morning light. Probably. Probably? She's got opinions, but she's gentle enough for a beginner." He handed Alara the reins. "Here, just hold them for now. Let her get used to you." Alara took the leather straps with hands that were only slightly trembling. The mare's head swung toward her, nostrils flaring as she took in this new human scent. Up close, the animal was enormous, all muscle and heat and barely contained power. "She's so big." "She's actually on the small side." Colt walked around to the mare's other side, checking the saddle with practiced efficiency. "You should see the gelding I usually ride. Makes Rosie here look like a pony." He came back around and stood next to Alara, close enough that she could smell leather and soap and something else. Wood smoke, maybe. Or sage from the prairie. "All right, first lesson, mounting. You're going to put your left foot in the stirrup, grab the saddle horn with your left hand, and the cantle, that's the back of the saddle, with your right, then swing your right leg over. Try not to kick her in the process." "That's a lot of steps. You'll get used to it." He gestured toward the stirrup. "Go on." Alara approached the mare's side, acutely aware of Colt watching her. She managed to get her foot into the stirrup on the second try, grabbed the saddle where he'd indicated, and pulled herself up. Or tried to. She made it about halfway before her arms gave out and she slid back down, stumbling into Colt's chest. His hands caught her elbows, steadying her. "You need more momentum," he said, not stepping back. "Don't pull yourself up. Push off the ground with your right leg. Use your body weight." "Easy for you to say." "Try again." She did. This time she got higher, swinging her right leg up and over with enough force that she nearly went off the other side. Colt's hand shot out, gripping her calf and stopping her from sliding. "Whoa. Settle." Alara grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, heart hammering. She was up. She was actually sitting on a horse. "Good," Colt said. "Now, adjust your seat. You're perched like you're ready to jump off. Sit back. Relax." "I'm on top of an animal that weighs 10 times what I do. Relaxing seems counterintuitive." "She's not going to buck you off unless you give her a reason. Just breathe." He showed her how to hold the reins, how to sit with her weight centered, how to keep her heels down in the stirrups. His instructions were clear and patient, more patient than she'd expected from a man who seemed to operate at one speed, efficient. "All right, Bob," he said finally, stepping back. "We're going to walk her around the corral a few times. Don't try to steer yet, just get used to the movement." He clicked his tongue, and the mare started walking. Alara lurched forward, then back, then forward again as she tried to find the rhythm. "Don't fight it," Colt called. "Move with her." Easy for him to say. He probably came out of the womb knowing how to ride. But gradually, painfully, she started to understand what he meant. The mare's gait had a pattern to it, a rolling motion that she could anticipate if she paid attention. They circled the corral 4 times before Colt called for her to stop. Pulling back on the reins felt wrong, like she was hurting the horse, but Rosie halted obediently enough. "Not bad," Colt said. "Tomorrow we'll work on steering. For today, that's enough." Dismounting proved almost as challenging as mounting. Alara swung her right leg over, misjudged the distance to the ground, and landed hard enough to jar her teeth. Her legs felt like jelly. "You'll be sore tomorrow," Colt warned, taking the reins. "Walking will help. So will a hot bath, but I know the pump's a pain." "I'll manage." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his face. "You say that a lot." "Because it's true." "Yeah." He turned to lead Rosie back to the barn. "I'm starting to believe you." She spent the rest of the morning working through the ache in her muscles, tackling the upstairs hallway with the same grim determination she'd applied to everything else. The walls were dingy with age and smoke. The floor was scarred and uneven, but she scrubbed and swept until it looked at least inhabitable. Around noon, she heard hoofbeats and looked out the window to see a wagon approaching. Not Colt. He was out on the range somewhere with Marcus. This was someone new. She went downstairs and opened the front door just as a woman climbed down from the wagon with surprising agility, given that she had to be in her 60s. "Well?" the woman said, looking Alara up and down with sharp eyes. So you're the one who finally got Colt Mercer's house in order. I'm the housekeeper, yes. Housekeeper. The woman snorted. That what they're calling it? I'm Dorothy Brennan. My husband Tom told me there was a new woman at Red Hollow, and I had to come see for myself. Tom. The man from the way station. Alara remembered him now, the warning about Colt being rough as a cob. Alara Quinn, would you like to come in? Don't mind if I do. Brought you some things. Dorothy went back to the wagon and retrieved a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Eggs for my chickens, some preserves, bread I baked yesterday. Figured you could use supplies way out here. The kindness of it hit Alara unexpectedly hard. That's very generous. It's practical. Can't have you starving to death before you've had a chance to civilize this place. Dorothy marched past her into the house, then stopped, looking around with obvious approval. Well, I'll be. You've actually made a difference. Last time I was here, must have been 6 months ago, you could barely see the floor for all the mess. She set the basket on the table and turned to face Alara with her hands on her hips. So, what's your story, girl? And don't tell me you came all the way out here just for the pleasure of scrubbing Colt Mercer's floors. Alara hesitated, but there was something about Dorothy's directness that invited honesty. My brother owed Mr. Mercer money. This was the arrangement to settle the debt. Ah. Dorothy's expression shifted, not to pity, but to understanding. So you're stuck here whether you like it or not. I wouldn't say stuck. What would you say? I'd say, Alara considered, I'd say it's different from what I'm used to, but not worse. High praise for the Montana Territory? Dorothy settled herself into one of the chairs without being invited and gestured for Alara to sit. Well, since you're here for the foreseeable future, you might as well know what you're dealing with. Colt's not a bad man, but he's a hard one. Lost his father 4 years back, and it changed him. The ranch is in trouble, Alara said. It wasn't a question. Smart girl. Yes, it is. Old man Mercer built this place from nothing, worked himself into an early grave doing it, left it to Colt, who's been trying to keep it running ever since. But cattle prices are down, drought's been bad the last 2 summers, and Colt's too stubborn to ask for help even when he needs it. Someone came by last week. Henderson. Trying to buy land. Dorothy's mouth thinned. That vulture. He's been circling for months, waiting for Colt to fail. Probably tell him it's for his own good, making an offer. But Henderson doesn't do anything for anyone's good but his own. She leaned forward, fixing Alara with an intense stare. Listen to me. Colt needs help, even if he'd rather eat glass than admit it. You seem like you've got a good head on your shoulders. If you can keep him fed and this house running, that's one less thing he has to worry about. And maybe, just maybe, that'll be enough to tip the scales. I'm just the housekeeper. Honey, there's no such thing as just anything out here. Everyone pulls weight or the whole operation falls apart. She stood, brushing off her skirts. Now, I'm going to teach you how to manage those chickens, because I saw the coop out back and those poor birds look half wild. Dorothy stayed for 3 hours, showing Alara how to collect eggs without getting pecked, how to tell which hens were laying and which were just loafing, how to mix feed and keep the water fresh. She was patient but exacting, correcting Alara's technique without softening the criticism. You'll learn, she said finally, as she prepared to leave. You've got the temperament for it, I can tell. Most city girls come out here expecting some kind of adventure and then fold the first time they break a nail. But you're different. How can you tell? Because you don't complain. You just do the work. Dorothy climbed back onto her wagon with practiced ease. I'll come by again in a couple weeks. Meantime, if you need anything, our ranch is about 10 miles northeast. Just follow the creek until you see the windmill. Thank you for everything. Thank me by keeping that stubborn fool fed and this ranch running. She picked up the reins. And Alara? Don't let Colt's rough edges scare you off. He's a good man underneath all that bark. Just needs someone who doesn't flinch. She drove off, leaving Alara standing in the yard with a basket of eggs and a head full of new information. That evening, she made dinner with Dorothy's bread and fresh eggs, adding them to the usual fried meat and potatoes. When the men came in, Jack took one bite and looked up in surprise. This is good. Different. Thank you. Where'd you learn to cook like this? My mother. It was the first time she'd volunteered personal information. She was a good cook. I watched her for years before she died. The men exchanged glances. Pete looked like he wanted to ask more, but didn't quite dare. Marcus just nodded, his usual reserved acknowledgement. Colt ate in silence, as always. But when he finished, he carried his plate to the sink himself instead of leaving it on the table. "Mrs. Brennan came by," he said. "Yes, she brought supplies and taught me about the chickens. Dorothy's good people." He paused, hands braced on the edge of the sink. "She tell you about my father?" "A little." "Then you know the ranch is struggling." It wasn't a question, so Alara didn't answer. She just kept washing dishes, giving him space to talk or not talk as he chose. "I'm going to save it," Colt said finally. "Whatever it takes. This land, it meant everything to him. I'm not going to be the one who loses it." The conviction in his voice was absolute. Alara found herself believing him, even knowing the odds were against him. "I'll help however I can," she said. He looked at her, surprised. "You're already helping, more than you know." Then he left, and Alara stood in the kitchen with her hands in dishwater, wondering when exactly she'd started caring about the fate of this ranch and the stubborn man trying to save it. The next morning, true to his word, Colt had her back on Rosie learning to steer. It was frustrating work. The mare seemed to have her own opinions about where they should go, and Alara's tentative pulls on the reins weren't authoritative enough to change her mind. "You're asking her," Colt said, watching from the center of the corral. "You need to tell her. Be firm. I don't want to hurt her." "You won't. The bit's designed to communicate, not injure. Pull harder." Alara gritted her teeth and pulled. Rosie's head came around, and she turned in the direction Alara wanted. The small victory felt enormous. "Good. Again." They worked for an hour before Colt called it. Alara's legs were screaming by the time she dismounted, but she managed to land without falling this time. "You're getting better," Colt said. "Another week, and you'll be ready to ride out with me. To check fence line, among other things." He took Rosie's reins. "Ranch work is never just one thing, Miss Quinn. It's 100 small tasks that all need doing at once." She believed it. She'd seen how he worked. Always moving, always fixing something, always 3 steps ahead of disaster. It was exhausting just to watch. The days fell into a new pattern. Morning rides before breakfast. Cooking, cleaning, learning. The house continued its transformation from disaster to merely shabby. The chickens started producing more eggs once they were being properly cared for. Even the kitchen garden, which had been nothing but weeds when she'd arrived, began showing signs of life after she'd cleared and watered it. 2 weeks after Dorothy's visit, Alara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard shouting from the direction of the barn. She dropped the sheet she'd been pinning and ran. The scene that greeted her made her heart stop. Colt was on the ground, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. His horse, the big gelding he usually rode, was rearing and kicking, eyes rolling white with panic. Jack and Marcus were trying to calm the animal while Pete stood frozen, clearly unsure what to do. Alara didn't think. She ran to Colt, dropping to her knees beside him. "Don't move," she said, even though he was already trying to sit up. "Let me see." "I'm fine," he growled, but his voice was strained. "You're bleeding all over yourself. That's not fine." She pulled off her apron and pressed it against the wound. "What happened?" "Spooked. Something in the barn. Snake, maybe. He threw me into the fence post. Head wounds bled a lot. She knew that from watching her mother tend to Tobias after his various bar fights. But this looked bad. The gash was deep, and Colt's face was already starting to swell. "We need to get you inside," she said. "I said I'm fine. And I said we need to get you inside." She looked up at Jack, who'd managed to get the gelding under control. "Help me." Between her and Jack, they got Colt on his feet and into the house. He tried to protest the whole way, but the fact that he was leaning heavily on Jack told Alara everything she needed to know about how fine he actually was. They got him into a chair in the kitchen. Alara pumped water, grabbed clean rags, and set to work cleaning the wound. "This needs stitches," she said. "No doctor within 20 miles, Jack said. "And by the time we got there, I can do it." The words came out before she'd fully thought them through, but her mother had taught her basic wound care. And she'd stitched up Tobias more than once, though he'd usually been too drunk to notice if she did a good job. Colt looked at her through his one good eye. The other was swelling shut. "You sure?" "No, but I'm better than nothing." Can't argue with that logic. He leaned back in the chair. "Do what you need to do." She found needle and thread in her sewing kit, boiled them for sanitation the way her mother had shown her, and then poured whiskey over the wound. Colt hissed, but didn't pull away. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Most things do. The first stitch was the hardest. Her hands were shaking and she had to stop twice to steady them. But muscle memory kicked in. The careful pierce of the needle, the pull of the thread, the knot to secure it. She'd done this before, just never on someone she actually cared about keeping alive. That thought should have startled her. She pushed it aside and focused on the work. By the time she finished, Colt's knuckles were white from gripping the chair arms, but he hadn't made a sound beyond that initial hiss. "Done," she said, tying off the last stitch. "It's not pretty, but it'll hold." "Pretty's overrated." He tried to stand and immediately swayed. "Oh, no, you don't?" Alara put a hand on his shoulder, pushing him back down. "You're concussed. You need to rest." "I've got work." "The work will still be there tomorrow. Jack, can you and Marcus handle things for the rest of the day?" Jack nodded. "We'll manage." "I don't need a nursemaid," Colt protested. "Good thing I'm not offering to be one. I'm telling you to stay put and not do anything stupid. There's a difference." She crossed her arms. "Unless you'd like to explain to Dorothy Brennan why you bled to death from stubbornness." That got a snort that might have been laughter. "You've been talking to Dorothy too much. She's a sensible woman. I could do worse for influences." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he had that day with Henderson. "You're not what I expected, Miss Quinn. Neither are you, Mr. Mercer." The moment stretched between them, strange and weighted with something Alara couldn't quite name. Then Jack cleared his throat and the spell broke. "Come on, Pete," Jack said. "Let's give them some peace." When they'd gone, Alara pulled up another chair and sat down across from Colt. "Does your head hurt?" "Like someone's driving railroad spikes through it." "That's the concussion. You should probably stay awake for a while. I'll make coffee." "You don't have to babysit me." "I'm not babysitting. I'm making sure my employer doesn't die on my watch. It would look bad on my employment record." This time he definitely laughed, though it was short and pained. "Fair enough." She made coffee, and they sat in surprisingly comfortable silence, drinking it while the afternoon light slanted through the now clean windows. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch continuing without them. Horses moving in the corral, chickens clucking, the wind in the grass. "Why'd you do it?" Colt asked suddenly. "Do what?" "Stay." Most women would have been on the first coach back east after seeing this place. Alara considered the question. "I told you. I had nowhere else to go." "That's not the whole truth." No, it wasn't. The whole truth was more complicated. The whole truth was that for the first time in her life, she'd found a place where her worth wasn't tied to her appearance or her marriage prospects or her ability to be decorative. Here, she was valued for what she could do, not what she looked like. Here, she was useful. "Maybe," she said slowly, "I'm tired of running from places that don't want me. Maybe I'd rather try building something somewhere I can actually make a difference." Colt was quiet for a long time. Then, "This place is hard, Alara. It doesn't give second chances." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed. "Then I guess I'll have to get it right the first time." He smiled, actually smiled, the expression transforming his face into something younger and less careworn. "Yeah, I guess you will." She made him rest for the remainder of the day, bringing him food and checking his pupils every few hours the way her mother had taught her. By evening, the swelling around his eye had gone down slightly, and he was more alert. "I should get to bed," he said, standing carefully. "Do you need help?" "I can manage." He paused at the doorway. "Thank you. For the stitches. For everything." "You're welcome." After he'd gone upstairs, Alara sat alone in the kitchen and let herself acknowledge what she'd been avoiding all day. She'd been terrified when she'd seen him on the ground. Not because he was her employer or because she needed this job, but because the thought of him being seriously hurt had sent ice through her veins. She was starting to care about Colt Mercer, and that was dangerous. Because caring meant vulnerability. It meant risk. And she'd spent 23 years learning that the safest thing was not to care at all. But it was too late now. The feeling was there, lodged somewhere behind her ribs, and she couldn't dig it out any more than she could stop the sun from rising, so she'd just have to live with it. The next morning, Colt came down to breakfast looking like he'd been in a bar fight and lost. The stitches pulled at the skin above his eye, and the bruising had spread across half his face in shades of purple and green. but he was moving steadily, and his eyes were clear. "How do you feel?" Alara asked, sliding a plate of eggs in front of him. "Like I got kicked by a horse." "You did get kicked by a horse. Technically, you got thrown into a fence post, but close enough. Smart mouth this morning." "Just this morning?" He looked up at her, and there was something in his expression, warmth maybe, or the beginnings of actual friendliness. "You know what, Miss Quinn? I think Dorothy was right about you." "About what?" "You don't flinch." After breakfast, against her advice and his better judgment, Colt went back to work. She watched him ride out with Jack, moving more slowly than usual, but moving nonetheless, and felt that familiar twist of worry. She channeled it into cleaning the last room she'd been avoiding, Colt's bedroom. She knocked first, even though she knew he was gone. No answer, obviously. She pushed open the door. The room was surprisingly austere. A bed, barely made, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a trunk at the foot of the bed. No personal touches, no decorations, nothing that said a human being actually lived here. Except for one thing. On the dresser sat the daguerreotype she'd found weeks ago. The young couple, formal and unsmiling. She picked it up, studying it in the better light. The man looked a bit like Colt. Same strong jaw, same serious eyes. His father, probably. And the woman next to him must have been his mother. She looked young in the photo, maybe 18 or 19. Alara set it down carefully and got to work. The room didn't take long. There was less mess here than anywhere else in the house. Colt clearly didn't spend much time in it beyond sleeping. She changed the sheets, swept the floor, dusted what little there was to dust. She was leaving when she noticed a book on the floor next to the bed, partially hidden under the frame. She picked it up, intending to set it on the dresser. It was a journal, leather-bound, worn from handling. She knew she shouldn't open it. She opened it anyway. The handwriting was strong and steady, definitely not Colt's based on the bills and receipts she'd seen. This must have been his father's. She flipped through pages filled with observations about weather, notes on cattle prices, sketches of fence designs. A working man's journal, practical and unadorned. Then, near the end, the entries changed. "Sarah's getting worse. Doc says there's nothing more he can do. I don't know how to tell Colt his mother isn't coming home. She passed yesterday evening, quiet and peaceful, thank the Lord." Colt didn't cry. 10 years old, and he just stood there at her grave like he was made of stone. I don't know if that's strength or if I've already failed him as a father. Henderson came by again with that damn offer, told him where he could shove it. This land is Sarah's legacy to our boy. I'll die before I sell a single acre. The last entry was dated 4 years ago. Just a few lines. Tired today. Chest hurts. Getting old, I guess. Need to talk to Colt about taking over more of the operation. He's ready, even if he doesn't think he is. This ranch will be his someday. Hope I taught him everything he needs to know. Alara closed the journal carefully, her throat tight. She set it back exactly where she'd found it and left the room. Downstairs, she threw herself into making bread, kneading the dough with more force than necessary. The story the journal told was clear enough. A boy who'd lost his mother at 10, his father at, 29? 30? Left alone with a failing ranch and the weight of his parents' legacy pressing down on his shoulders. No wonder he was so hard. No wonder he worked himself to exhaustion. He was trying to honor the dead by refusing to fail. She was sliding the bread into the oven when the door burst open. Pete stood there, wild-eyed and panting. "Miss Quinn, you need to come quick. It's Mr. Mercer. Something's wrong." Her heart dropped into her stomach. What happened? He was working on the barn roof, fixing loose shingles, and he just collapsed. Won't wake up. Alara didn't remember running. One moment she was in the kitchen, the next she was at the barn, dropping to her knees beside Colt's prone form. He was breathing but unconscious, his face pale despite the bruising. The wound above his eye had split open, blood seeping through the stitches. "How long has he been out?" she demanded. "Few minutes," Jack said, crouched on Colt's other side. "Came down off that roof like a sack of grain." Concussion, it had to be. He'd pushed himself too hard, too soon, and his body had given out. "We need to get him inside, carefully, support his head." Between the three of them, they managed to carry Colt into the house and up to his room. Alara sent Pete for water and clean rags, then set about examining the damage. The split stitches were the least of her concerns. His pulse was steady but weak. His breathing was shallow, and he wouldn't wake up no matter what she tried. "Should we ride for a doctor?" Marcus asked. Alara did quick mental math. 20 miles to town, 20 miles back, assuming the doctor was even there and not out on a call. That was at least 4 hours, probably more. "Not yet," she said. "Let me try something first." She'd seen her mother do this once when Tobias had drunk himself into unconsciousness, smelling salts or something close to them. She went to the kitchen, grabbed the bottle of ammonia she used for cleaning, and brought it back upstairs. Waving it under Colt's nose made her own eyes water, but it had the desired effect. He jerked awake with a gasp, disoriented and flailing. "Easy," Alara said, catching his hands. "You're all right. You're in your room. You collapsed." "What?" He tried to sit up and immediately fell back, groaning. "Christ, that's what happens when you work with a concussion, you stubborn fool." She pushed him back down when he tried again. "You're staying in this bed if I have to tie you to it. You've got a real talent for threats. You know that? And you've got a real talent for ignoring medical advice." She examined the split stitches. "I'm going to have to redo these." He didn't argue this time, just lay there and let her work. His silence was more alarming than protests would have been. When she'd finished restitching the wound, she pulled a chair up next to the bed. "Someone needs to watch you. Make sure you don't go unconscious again." "I'm fine." "You passed out on a roof. You're not fine." "The ranch will survive one day without you." She crossed her arms. "Jack and Marcus can handle things. Pete will help, and you're going to rest." "Since when do you give orders around here?" "Since you hired someone competent and then refused to listen to her good sense." She softened her tone slightly. "Please, Colt, just one day. That's all I'm asking." He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "One day. Thank you." She stayed with him through the afternoon, keeping watch while he drifted in and out of sleep. Every hour, she'd wake him to check his responses, make sure the concussion wasn't getting worse. Around evening, he opened his eyes and stayed awake longer than a few minutes. "You don't have to keep vigil," he said. "I'm not dying." "I know, but I'm staying anyway." "Why?" The question was genuine, not confrontational. Alara considered how to answer honestly without saying too much. "Because you matter," she said finally. "Not just to the ranch or the hands or this house. You matter, and I'm not going to let you kill yourself through stubbornness if I can help it." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor he wore so constantly. "I don't deserve that kind of loyalty." "Maybe not, but you have it anyway." He was quiet for a while. Then, "Read to me?" "What?" "There's a book, top drawer of the dresser. I can't sleep, but I can't think straight either. Just read something. Anything." She found the book. A battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, of all things. She settled back into her chair and opened it to a random page. Her voice filled the room, reading words written centuries ago about love and loss and time's inexorable march. Colt listened with his eyes closed, his breathing steady and deep. By the time she finished the third sonnet, he was asleep. Alara set the book aside and allowed herself to study his face in the lamplight. The bruising made him look vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. The hard lines had softened in sleep. She thought about those journal entries, about a boy standing stone-faced at his mother's grave, about a young man taking on a failing ranch because it was his parents' legacy, about a man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. Her hand moved without conscious decision, brushing a strand of hair back from his forehead, careful to avoid the wound. He didn't wake. She sat there well into the night, keeping watch, and somewhere in those quiet hours admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. She wasn't just starting to care about Colt Mercer, she was falling for him. And that changed everything. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it settled over Alara like something she'd been carrying without knowing it, finally acknowledged and set down where she could see it clearly. She was falling for Colt Mercer, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. She stayed in that chair until the lamp oil burned low, and the first gray light of dawn started seeping through the window. Colt slept through the night without incident, his breathing deep and even. The color had returned to his face, and when she checked his pupils one last time before heading downstairs to start breakfast, they responded normally. He'd be all right. Stubborn men usually were. The kitchen was cold and dark when she entered it. She went through the familiar motions of building a fire in the stove, her mind still upstairs in that room, still wrapped around the impossible fact of her feelings. What did she think was going to happen? That Colt would suddenly see her as something other than the housekeeper his conscience had acquired through a debt? That a man like him, hard and self-sufficient and determined to save his family's legacy, would have room in his life for a woman the rest of the world had deemed unmarriageable? The coffee was boiling when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She turned, ready to scold Colt for being out of bed, but it was Jack who appeared in the doorway. "Morning," he said, taking his usual seat. "How's the boss?" "Sleeping, finally." She poured him coffee. "He needs another day of rest, but I doubt I'll be able to keep him in bed that long." "Probably not." Jack wrapped his weathered hands around the cup. "Mercer men don't know how to quit. His daddy was the same way. Worked himself into the ground and called it dedication. Dorothy mentioned he died young, 47. Heart gave out while he was mending fence." Jack's expression was distant, remembering. Colt found him, carried him all the way back to the house, even though he had to know it was too late. Kid was 29 years old and suddenly responsible for everything. The ranch, the debt his father had accumulated trying to expand during bad years, the legacy. Hell of a burden. Alara cracked eggs into the pan, watching them sizzle and pop. He never talks about it. He doesn't talk about much of anything, in case you haven't noticed, but he feels it all the same. Maybe feels it more because he keeps it locked up so tight. Jack took a long drink of coffee. "You're good for him, you know. This place hasn't looked this alive since his mother was living here." The comment caught her off guard. "I'm just doing my job, if that's what you want to call it." Jack's knowing look made heat rise in her cheeks. "But I've been working ranches for 30 years, Miss Quinn, and I know the difference between someone doing a job and someone building a home." Before she could respond, Marcus and Pete arrived, and the moment was lost in the routine of serving breakfast and listening to their plans for the day. They'd be moving cattle to the north pasture, checking water levels in the creek, reinforcing a section of fence that was looking questionable. All the work Colt would normally be directing. "I'll check on him periodically," Alara said. "Make sure he's actually resting." "Good luck with that," Pete said, and the men laughed. After they left, she carried a plate upstairs and knocked softly on Colt's door. When there was no answer, she pushed it open. He was awake, sitting up against the headboard, looking restless and irritated. "I brought food," she said. "I should be out there working." "You should be resting. Here." She set the plate on his lap. "Eat." He picked up the fork but didn't start eating immediately. "You stayed all night." "Someone had to." "Jack could have." "Jack has work to do. I was already here." She busied herself opening the curtains, letting morning light flood the room. "How's your head?" "Hurts less than yesterday." "That's something." She turned to face him. "Colt, you can't keep pushing yourself like this. Your body has limits even if you refuse to acknowledge them." "The ranch doesn't care about my limits." "No, but I do." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "And I'm not going to watch you kill yourself trying to honor the dead." His head snapped up, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "What did you say?" Too late, she realized her mistake. When I was cleaning yesterday, I found your father's journal. I didn't mean to read it, but you did anyway." His voice was flat, unreadable. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the plate in his lap. Then, "What did it say?" "The journal. Enough to understand why you're so determined to save this place, why you can't let yourself fail. He built this from nothing." Colt's jaw tightened. "My mother died believing in it. My father spent his last breath worrying about it. And I'm watching it slip away because cattle prices dropped and the drought won't break and I can't—" He stopped, the words choking off. Alara moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You can't control the weather or the market. All you can control is how hard you work, and you're already doing everything humanly possible. It's not enough." "Maybe not. But destroying yourself won't save the ranch either. It'll just mean you lose it and your health." She took a breath, choosing her next words carefully. "Your father wouldn't want that. Neither would your mother." "You didn't know them." "No. But I know what it's like to carry impossible expectations, to feel like you're failing people who aren't even here to judge you anymore." She thought of her own parents, of Tobias's constant reminders that she was a burden, that she'd disappointed them all by being born plain. Sometimes the hardest thing is letting go of what you think you owe the dead and focusing on what you owe yourself. Colt looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes went deeper than physical fatigue. What do I owe myself? A life. Not just survival, but actually living. She stood before she could say anything more revealing. Eat your breakfast. I'll check on you in a few hours. She was at the door when he spoke again. Elara. She stopped, her hand on the doorframe. Thank you for last night, for caring enough to stay. The vulnerability in his voice nearly undid her. She didn't trust herself to turn around, to let him see what was written on her face. Get some rest, Colt. She fled downstairs and threw herself into work, scrubbing the floors with unnecessary vigor, kneading bread dough until her arms ached. Anything to avoid thinking about the way he'd looked at her, the way her name had sounded in his voice. Around midday, Dorothy appeared again, this time with a basket of vegetables from her garden. Heard Colt took a tumble, she said, setting the basket on the table. How bad is it? Concussion? He collapsed yesterday working on the barn roof. Elara started sorting through the vegetables. Carrots, potatoes, some early squash. I managed to keep him in bed for a day, but I doubt he'll stay there much longer. Stubborn fool, just like his father. Dorothy settled into a chair with the ease of someone who knew she was welcome. And how are you holding up? I'm fine. That's what you always say. Dorothy's sharp eyes missed nothing. But you've got shadows under your eyes like you haven't slept in days, and you're scrubbing that counter like it personally offended you. So I'll ask again, how are you? Elara's hands stilled. For a moment she considered deflecting again, but something about Dorothy's directness, her genuine concern, made the truth rise up in her throat. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. This place, Colt, it's all starting to matter too much. And I don't know what happens when things matter and then they're taken away. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, walked over, and put a weathered hand on Elara's shoulder. Honey, things that matter are always scary. That's how you know they're worth having. She squeezed gently. But I'll tell you something else. That boy upstairs? He's scared too. Maybe even more than you are. Because he's been alone so long, he's forgotten what it's like to have someone in his corner who isn't being paid to be there. I am being paid to be here. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you went way past housekeeper duties the moment you stitched up his head and sat vigil all night. Dorothy moved back to her chair. Question is, what are you going to do about it? There's nothing to do. I'm the help. He's my employer. That's all there is. If that's what you truly believe, then you're not as smart as I thought you were. Dorothy stood, gathering her shawl. But I don't think you believe it. I think you're just afraid to want something for yourself after spending years being told you couldn't have it. The words hit like a physical blow. Elara gripped the edge of the counter, fighting against the sudden burning in her eyes. What if I'm not enough? The question came out barely above a whisper. What if I let myself want this, and it turns out I'm still just the plain girl nobody chose? Then you'll survive it, same as you've survived everything else. Dorothy's voice was firm but kind. But you might also find out that the right person has been seeing you all along. You just had to learn to see yourself first. She left before Elara could formulate a response, and the kitchen felt impossibly empty in her wake. Elara stood there for a long time, Dorothy's words echoing in her head. Then she dried her hands, smoothed her apron, and went back upstairs. Colt was out of bed, standing at the window in his undershirt and pants, looking out over the ranch. You're supposed to be resting, she said. I've rested enough. He didn't turn around. Come here. I want to show you something. She crossed to the window. From this vantage point, she could see the entire spread. The barn and bunkhouse, the corrals where horses moved lazily in the afternoon heat, the rolling prairie stretching out to distant hills. The land looked harsh and beautiful at the same time, unforgiving but somehow honest in its severity. My father used to stand here every morning, Colt said. He'd look out at all this and plan his day. My mother said it was his way of reminding himself what he was working for. He was quiet for a moment. I never understood it when I was younger. It's just land, dirt and grass and stubborn cattle. But now? Elara prompted. Now I get it. It's not about the land itself. It's about what it represents, permanence, legacy. The idea that you can build something that outlasts you. He finally looked at her. You've done that, built something here. I've cleaned a house. That's hardly. You've made it a home again. There's a difference. He turned fully to face her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. When I was lying on the ground yesterday, half conscious and bleeding, you know what I thought about? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. I thought about how you'd be angry with me for being careless, how you'd scold me while you fixed me up, like you did with the stitches. And then I thought about how empty this place would feel if you weren't in it. He took a step closer. That's when I knew I was in trouble. Colt, let me finish. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. I'm not good at this. Talking about feelings, making speeches, I'm better with actions, with work. But you deserve words, so I'm going to try. He took a breath. You scare the hell out of me, Alara Quinn, because somewhere between you showing up with that small trunk and you sitting by my bedside reading Shakespeare, I stopped thinking of you as the housekeeper and started thinking of you as mine. The possessiveness in that last word should have alarmed her. Instead, it sent heat racing through her veins. I'm not property, she managed. No, you're not. You're a force of nature disguised as a woman who somehow convinced herself she's ordinary. He was close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. But I'm a rancher, Alara. I'm not good enough with words to say what I mean any other way. So yes, mine. The way the sun is mine every morning when it comes up over those hills. The way this land is mine because I work it and bleed for it and refuse to let it go. That's... She didn't know how to finish that sentence. Overwhelming? Terrifying? The most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her despite its rough edges. I know this complicates things, Colt continued. You came here because you had no choice, and that's not fair to you. If you want to leave, I'll understand. I'll pay your way back east and give you enough money to start over somewhere. But if you stay, I'm staying. The words were out before she'd fully processed them, but once they were spoken, she knew they were true. I'm staying because I choose to, not because of the job or the debt or any obligation, because I want to be here, with you. Something shifted in his expression, relief and wonder, and something fiercer that made her pulse race. You're sure? For the first time in my life, I'm sure about something. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the chaste pecks she'd witnessed at church socials or the rough, drunken affection Tobias had forced on unfortunate women. This was deliberate and searching, his hands framing her face like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. She kissed him back with all the pent-up longing she'd been denying for weeks, rising up on her toes to close the distance between them, and somewhere in the back of her mind marveled that this closeness, this wanting, was allowed to her after all. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. How to be with someone. How to let someone in. Neither do I. She touched his face, careful of the healing wound. I guess we'll figure it out together. Together. He said it like he was testing the word, seeing how it felt. Yeah, I could get used to that. They stood there in the afternoon light, tangled up in each other, and the future they were tentatively building, and for a moment everything felt possible. Then reality intruded in the form of hoofbeats approaching the house. Colt tensed, pulling back to look out the window. We've got company. Alara followed his gaze and saw a wagon approaching, pulled by two fine horses and driven by a man in a suit that looked entirely impractical for ranch country. You expecting someone? She asked. No. Colt's jaw tightened. But I know who that is. Lawrence Pritchard. Owns the mercantile in town and half the businesses around it. Friend of yours? Hardly. He's been trying to buy land from me for the past year. He moved toward the door. Stay here. This won't take long. But Alara followed him downstairs anyway, curiosity winning out over obedience. They reached the front porch just as Pritchard was climbing down from his wagon. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair and the kind of soft hands that had never done hard labor. His smile was practiced and didn't reach his eyes. Mercer, heard you had an accident. Glad to see you on your feet. His gaze shifted to Alara, and something calculating entered his expression. And this must be your new housekeeper, the famous Miss Quinn everyone in town is talking about. Famous? Alara's stomach twisted. What exactly were people saying? What do you want, Pritchard? Colt's voice was ice. Just being neighborly. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're managing. He gestured broadly at the ranch. These are hard times for everyone, you know. Drought, low prices, even the most capable men are struggling. I'm managing just fine. Are you? Pritchard's smile sharpened. Because from what I hear, you're down to 3 hands and haven't been able to make your loan payment on time in 6 months. That doesn't sound like fine to me. Colt's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained level. My finances are none of your concern. Ordinarily, I'd agree. But when a valuable piece of property might become available, well, a smart businessman pays attention. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. I've had my lawyer draw up an offer. Very generous terms. You'd walk away with enough money to start over somewhere less demanding. Not interested. Don't be hasty, Mercer. At least look at the numbers. I said no. Pritchard's expression hardened slightly. You're being foolish. This ranch is failing. Your father couldn't make it work, and you won't either. Why not cut your losses now while you can still get something for it? My father built this place from nothing, Colt said, his voice dangerously quiet. He died working this land. I'm not selling his legacy to a vulture like you. Vulture? Pritchard laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm offering you a lifeline, son. When you lose everything, and you will, don't come crying to me for help. He turned to leave, then paused, looking at Alara with that calculating expression again. Miss Quinn, was it? A word of advice. Don't get too comfortable here. Ranches like this don't last, and neither do the positions that depend on them. A woman of your practicality should keep her options open. Before Alara could respond, Colt stepped forward. Get off my property. Now. Pritchard held up his hands in mock surrender. Just trying to be helpful. But have it your way. He climbed back into his wagon. I'll be waiting when you change your mind. And you will change your mind. They watched him drive away, the dust from his wheels hanging in the air like a threat. How bad is it? Alara asked quietly. The financial situation. Colt was silent for a long moment. Then, bad enough that he's not entirely wrong. I've been behind on loan payments since spring. The bank's been patient so far, but that won't last forever. Why didn't you tell me? Because it's my problem to solve, not yours. Colt, no. He turned to face her, and the vulnerability from upstairs was gone, replaced by that familiar wall. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. You getting tangled up in my failures. Your failures? Anger sparked through her shock. You're working yourself to death trying to save a ranch during a drought with no money and no help. That's not failure. That's survival. It's the same thing if I lose the land anyway. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, the only way you truly fail is if you give up, and I didn't take you for a quitter. He looked at her for a long moment, something like pain crossing his face. What if it's not enough? What if I work myself into the ground like my father did and lose everything anyway? Then we figure out what comes next. She moved closer, taking his hand. Together. Remember? His fingers tightened around hers. You really mean that? I really mean that. Some of the tension drained from his shoulders. He pulled her into an embrace, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. I don't deserve you, he murmured into her hair. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. She felt him smile against her temple. Stuck with you. Yeah, I could live with that. They stood there on the porch while the afternoon shadows lengthened, and Alara let herself imagine what it might be like if they actually made this work. If the ranch survived. If she stopped being the housekeeper and became something more permanent. It was a dangerous dream, but for the first time in her life, she thought maybe she deserved to dream it. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of limbo. The ranch work continued its relentless pace, cattle to move, fences to mend, hay to cut before the drought killed it entirely. Colt recovered from his concussion and threw himself back into work with the same intensity, though now Alara could see the worry beneath it. He was running out of time, and they both knew it. But in the stolen moments between work, over coffee in the morning, in the quiet after dinner when the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, something new was building between them. A careful intimacy born of shared purpose and growing trust. Colt taught her to ride properly, taking her out to check fence lines and water levels. She learned to read the land the way he did, to see where the grass was dying and where it still held on, to understand the language of clouds and wind and the subtle signs that meant rain might finally be coming. She taught him, in turn, that it was all right to rest sometimes, to sit on the porch in the evening instead of finding one more task to complete before bed, to talk about things that weren't ranch business, books he'd read, stories from her childhood before everything fell apart, dreams they'd both thought were impossible. And slowly, carefully, they began to build something that felt like a future. Then the invitation arrived. It came on a Wednesday, brought by the mail rider who stopped by every 2 weeks. Alara was hanging laundry when Jack brought it to her, a cream envelope with her name written in elegant script. "Came for you," he said, curiosity evident in his voice. "Fancy." She opened it with damp hands, spreading the heavy paper carefully. The Cattlemen's Association cordially invites you to their annual gathering, Saturday next, at the Henderson Ranch. Supper, dancing, and fellowship. All landowners and their households are welcome. Her stomach dropped. A social gathering, with all the ranchers in the territory and their families, where she'd be seen and judged and found wanting by people who were used to proper ladies, not plain housekeepers who'd been traded to settle debts. "What is it?" Colt's voice made her jump. She hadn't heard him approach. She handed him the invitation without a word. He read it, his expression darkening. "Henderson." He practically spat the name. "Of course it's at his place, showing off that spread he built by buying up failing ranches." "You don't have to go," Alara said. "Actually, I do. Missing it would be seen as weakness, and Henderson would love that." He looked at her. "But you don't have to come. These things can be difficult." She knew what he wasn't saying, that showing up with his housekeeper would invite gossip and speculation, that it might make things harder for him when he was already fighting to keep his ranch. The smart thing would be to decline, to stay home where she was safe from judgment. But she'd been hiding from the world for 23 years, and she was tired of it. "I'm going," she said. "Alara?" "I'm going," she repeated, more firmly. "If you're willing to face them, so am I." Something like pride flickered across his face. "It won't be easy. People talk." "Let them talk. I've survived worse than gossip." He pulled her into a quick, fierce kiss. "You're tougher than half the men I know." "Only half?" "Don't push it." The week leading up to the gathering passed in a blur of preparation. Alara had exactly one dress that was appropriate for a social event, a dark blue cotton that had been her mother's, carefully preserved and altered to fit. It wasn't fashionable, but it was clean and decent. Dorothy stopped by 3 days before the event, took one look at the dress, and declared it needed work. "Nothing wrong with the dress itself," she said, examining the seams critically, "but we can make it special. Add some trim, take in the waist a bit, maybe a new collar. You want to walk in there looking like you belong, not like you're apologizing for existing." They spent 2 evenings working on it together, Dorothy's experienced hands guiding Alara through alterations she'd never attempted. By the time they finished, the dress looked transformed. Still simple, but elegant in its simplicity. "There," Dorothy said with satisfaction. "Now you look like a rancher's wife instead of just the help." The word wife made Alara's heart skip, but she didn't correct it. Saturday arrived too quickly. Colt borrowed a proper wagon from the Brennans and hitched up his best horses. He cleaned up in a way Alara had never seen, shaved, hair combed back, wearing actual dress clothes instead of work gear. The stitches had come out 2 days ago, leaving a thin scar above his eye that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than damaged. "Ready?" he asked, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. "No, but let's go anyway." The ride to Henderson's ranch took about an hour. As they got closer, Alara could see other wagons and riders converging on a large, sprawling house that looked like it was trying very hard to be a mansion despite being made of Montana timber. "Henderson likes to show off," Colt muttered. "Rebuilt the whole place last year after he bought out the Carlsons. Wants everyone to know he's successful." The yard was already crowded with people. Men in their best suits, women in dresses far finer than Alara's, children running between the wagons. She felt Colt's hand find hers and squeeze. "Stay close to me," he said quietly. "And remember, you belong here as much as any of them." She wished she believed that. They climbed down from the wagon and immediately became the center of attention. Alara felt eyes on her from every direction, heard the whispers starting. "That's Mercer's new housekeeper. Heard he got her to settle a debt? Poor thing. Wonder how long she'll last." Alara lifted her chin and refused to shrink. Colt's hand was steady at the small of her back as they made their way toward the house. Dorothy appeared like a guardian angel, Tom at her side. "There you are. Come on, let's get you settled before the vultures circle." She linked arms with Alara, physically inserting herself between Alara and the staring crowd. "Don't mind them. They're just jealous that Colt found someone with actual sense instead of one of their vapid daughters." The interior of the house was indeed impressive. Polished wood floors, a grand staircase, furniture that looked like it had been shipped from back east at enormous expense. A long table was set up with food, and people clustered in groups, talking and laughing. Henderson himself stood near the fireplace, holding court with several other ranchers. When he saw Colt, his smile turned predatory. "Mercer, glad you could make it. And you brought your housekeeper." He said the word like it was something distasteful. "How progressive of you." "Miss Quinn has as much right to be here as anyone else," Colt said evenly. "Oh, I'm sure. I just mean, well, usually we see landowners and their wives at these things, but I suppose times are changing." He turned to Alara with that calculating smile. "Miss Quinn, I don't think we've been properly introduced. Lawrence Henderson. I own this ranch and several others in the territory." "Mr. Henderson," she kept her voice neutral. "You've done wonders with Colt's place, from what I hear. Must be quite a change from Boston." So he'd been asking about her. Alara felt Colt tense beside her. "It's different," she said carefully. "But I'm adapting." "I'm sure you are. You seem like a very adaptable young woman." There was something in his tone that made her skin crawl. "In fact, I have a proposition for you." "Henderson," Colt started, but the older man held up a hand. "Hear me out. I'm expanding my operations and I could use someone with your organizational skills. I'd be willing to offer you a position, significantly better pay than what you're making now, your own cottage on the property, and you wouldn't have to worry about working for a failing enterprise." He said it loud enough that several nearby conversations stopped. "It's a generous offer, Miss Quinn. You should consider it carefully." The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what she'd say, waiting to see if she'd abandon Colt for better prospects. This was the test, she realized. Henderson wasn't just trying to poach an employee. He was trying to humiliate Colt in front of everyone by proving that even his housekeeper knew his ranch was doomed. Elora looked at Henderson's smug face, then at Colt, who was standing rigidly beside her, his jaw clenched, but his eyes held no expectation. He'd given her a way out earlier, and he was giving her one now. Whatever she chose, he wouldn't stop her. She turned back to Henderson and smiled. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Henderson, but I'm afraid I have to decline." His smile faltered. "You're turning down better wages and security?" "I'm staying where I'm valued for more than just my organizational skills." She let her gaze sweep the room, meeting the eyes of everyone who'd been whispering about her. "Red Hollow is my home. Colt is—" She hesitated, then decided to hell with propriety. "Colt is important to me, and I don't abandon people I care about just because things get difficult." The shock on Henderson's face was worth every bit of anxiety she'd felt about coming here. Around the room, she could see reactions ranging from surprise to approval to grudging respect. Colt's hand found hers again, his grip almost painful in its intensity. "Well," Henderson said finally, recovering his composure, "can't say I didn't try. But when Mercer's ranch fails, and it will fail, don't say I didn't warn you." "If it fails, we'll deal with it together," Alara said firmly. "But I don't think it will." She didn't know where the conviction came from, but once the words were out, she believed them. They'd find a way. They had to. Henderson turned away, dismissing them, and the normal chatter of the gathering resumed. But Alara could feel the shift in the room. She'd been tested and hadn't flinched. That mattered here, where people respected strength more than propriety. "You didn't have to do that," Colt murmured, his mouth close to her ear. "Yes, I did." Dorothy appeared with 2 glasses of punch and a triumphant expression. "That was magnificent. Did you see Henderson's face? I think you might have actually left him speechless." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Several ranchers' wives approached Alara, their initial curiosity giving way to genuine friendliness when they realized she wasn't going to compete for social status. She met families, learned about other ranches, started to understand the complex web of relationships and rivalries that made up this isolated community. And through it all, Colt stayed close, not hovering, but present, a steady anchor in unfamiliar social waters. When the dancing started, he surprised her by offering his hand. "I'm not very good at this," he warned. Neither am I. They fumbled through a waltz, stepping on each other's feet more than once, but Alara found she didn't care. She was in Colt's arms, in a room full of people who'd accepted her presence if not her position, and for the first time in her life she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. "Thank you," Colt said as they turned. "For what?" "For choosing me. For choosing this." He pulled her slightly closer. "For not flinching." She smiled up at him. "I told you. I don't flinch." The ride home that night was quiet, but comfortable. Alara leaned against Colt's shoulder as the wagon rolled through the darkness, watching stars wheel overhead. "I meant what I said," she told him. "About not abandoning you. I know. That's what scares me." "Why?" "Because now I have something to lose." His arm tightened around her. "Before you came, if the ranch failed, I'd only be letting down ghosts. But now you have me, and I'm not going anywhere." She sat up to look at him properly. "We're in this together, Colt. Whatever comes." He kissed her then, the wagon rolling to a stop in the middle of the dark prairie, and Alara thought that maybe Dorothy was right. Maybe the things that scared you most were the things most worth having. And maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found something worth being scared for. The wagon had barely stopped in front of the house when Alara saw the figure on the porch. Even in the darkness, she recognized the silhouette. The slouch of the shoulders, the nervous way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. Her entire body went cold. "Who's that?" Colt asked, his hand moving to the rifle he kept under the wagon seat. "My brother." The words came out flat. "That's Tobias." Colt's jaw tightened, but he climbed down from the wagon and helped Alara down with careful deliberateness. They walked toward the porch together, and as they got closer, lamplight from inside the house illuminated Tobias's face. He looked worse than when she'd left. Thinner. His clothes were rumpled and stained, his hair greasy. But his eyes were clear, sober for once, and fixed on Alara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Alara," he said, "you look different." "What are you doing here, Tobias?" "That's a hell of a greeting for your brother." He tried for a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Can't a man check on his sister?" "You sold me to settle a debt. I think we're past the point of fraternal concern." Tobias flinched, and Alara felt a savage satisfaction at landing the blow. Colt stood beside her, radiating quiet menace, his hand still close to where the rifle would be. "I deserve that," Tobias said quietly. "I deserve a lot worse than that. But I need to talk to you, please." Alara wanted to refuse, wanted to send him away without hearing whatever excuse or manipulation he'd traveled all this way to deliver. But curiosity, or maybe the remnants of old loyalty, made her nod. "Inside, but if you're drunk, I'm not. Haven't had a drop in 3 weeks." He said it like a confession. "That's part of why I'm here." They went inside and Alara lit the lamps while Colt positioned himself between her and Tobias, arms crossed. The protective stance should have annoyed her. She could fight her own battles, but instead it felt reassuring. Tobias looked around the kitchen, taking in the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the evidence of Alara's work. "You've made this place nice, real nice." "What do you want, Tobias?" He sat down heavily at the table without being invited. "I came to bring you home." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. "Home," Alara repeated. "I don't have a home in Boston. You made that clear when you traded me like property." I know I did, and I've regretted it every day since." He looked up at her, and there was something raw in his face. "I was desperate, Alara. The men I owed, they weren't the kind who accept excuses. They were going to kill me. When Mercer offered the arrangement, it seemed like the only way out. For you," Alara said coldly, "it was the only way out for you. I didn't get a choice. You're right. You didn't. And that makes me a bastard and a coward, and I'm not arguing otherwise." He rubbed his face. "But things have changed. I'm trying to change. I got a job, a real job, working at the docks. Pays decent. I've been sober for 3 weeks, like I said. I'm trying to put my life back together." "Good for you. And I want you to be part of it." He leaned forward. "Come back to Boston with me. We can start fresh, both of us. I'll take care of you properly this time. You can work at a shop, maybe find a decent man to marry. Have a real life instead of being stuck out here in the middle of nowhere working yourself to death." Colt made a sound low in his throat, but Alara held up a hand. This was her conversation to have. You think this isn't a real life? She asked. I think you're making the best of a bad situation, but you don't have to anymore. I'm offering you a way out. The same way you offered me a way out when you sent me here? Forgive me if I don't trust your judgment about what's best for me. Tobias's expression hardened. I'm trying to make things right. By asking me to give up everything I've built here? By assuming I want to go back to a city where I was invisible and unwanted? She felt anger building in her chest, hot and righteous. You have no idea what my life is like now. You don't get to show up after months and decide I need rescuing. I'm your brother. You stopped being my brother when you sold me. The words came out louder than she'd intended, echoing in the kitchen. A brother protects his sister, cares for her. You did neither. You used me to save yourself, and now you want me to pretend that didn't happen because you've been sober for 3 weeks? Tobias stood, his chair scraping against the floor. So what, you're just going to stay here? Playing house with a failing rancher in the middle of nowhere? What happens when this place goes under and he can't afford to keep you anymore? Colt moved forward, but Alara stepped in front of him. Don't, she said quietly. Then to Tobias, this place won't go under. And even if it did, I'm not here because Colt can afford to keep me. I'm here because I choose to be. Choose? Tobias laughed bitterly. You didn't have a choice when I sent you here. No, I didn't, but I have one now, and I'm choosing to stay. Something in Tobias's face crumpled. With him? You're choosing him over your own family? You stopped being my family the moment you decided I was disposable. Alara's voice was steady, though her hands were shaking. Colt has shown me more respect and kindness in 3 months than you did in 23 years. So yes, I'm choosing him. I'm choosing this life, and I'm asking you to leave. Alara's, leave, Tobias. There's nothing for you here. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant he realized she meant it. His shoulders slumped in defeat. I really did want to make things right, he said quietly. Then start by respecting my decision. He nodded slowly, then stood and walked toward the door. He paused in the doorway, looking back. For what it's worth, I am sorry. For all of it. I believe you, but sorry doesn't fix what was broken. After he left, the sound of his horse fading into the night, Alara stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen. The anger that had sustained her through the confrontation drained away, leaving her hollow and shaking. Colt's arms came around her from behind, solid and warm. You all right? I don't know. She leaned back against him. I sent him away. My only family. He gave up the right to call himself that a long time ago. I know, but it still feels... She couldn't finish the sentence, didn't know how to articulate the tangle of emotions in her chest. You don't have to explain. Colt turned her around to face him. You were brave. Standing up to him like that, choosing yourself. I chose you. You chose yourself first. That's what matters. He touched her face gently. And for the record, I'm damn glad you're staying. She kissed him, pouring all the emotions she couldn't name into it. Relief and fear and determination and something deeper that she wasn't ready to call love, but knew was heading that direction. When they finally pulled apart, Colt rested his forehead against hers. Whatever happens with the ranch, whatever the future holds, we face it together. You understand? Together, she agreed. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, holding on to each other like anchors in a storm. And Alara realized something. She'd spent her whole life being told she wasn't enough. Not pretty enough, not charming enough, not valuable enough to keep. But here, with Colt, she was exactly enough, more than enough. She was chosen. And that made all the difference. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Another day in the endless drought. Alara woke early, as had become her habit, and found Colt already gone. She could hear voices from outside, his and someone else's she didn't recognize. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Colt standing in the yard talking to a man on horseback. The stranger wore a suit despite the heat and carried himself with the kind of authority that meant official business. Alara's stomach dropped. She knew, somehow, what this was before anyone said a word. Colt saw her approaching and his expression confirmed her fears. Alara, this is Mr. Sullivan, from the bank. Miss Quinn. Sullivan tipped his hat. I apologize for the early intrusion, but this matter couldn't wait. What matter? Though she already knew. Sullivan pulled papers from his saddlebag. Mr. Mercer has been delinquent on his loan payments for 7 months. The bank has been patient, but we can't extend credit indefinitely. Unless payment is made in full within 30 days, we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings. The words landed like physical blows. 30 days. 4 weeks to save a ranch that had been struggling for years. How much? Alara asked. Sullivan named a figure that made her head spin. It might as well have been $1 million for how impossible it seemed. That's including the back payments and accumulated interest, he added, almost apologetically. If Mr. Mercer can make even a partial payment, we might be able to negotiate an extension. How partial? Colt's voice was tight. Half would show good faith, but ultimately, the full amount is due. After Sullivan left, Colt stood in the yard staring at nothing. Alara approached carefully, not sure what to say. What could you say when someone was watching their entire world collapse? I need to check on the north pasture, he said finally, his voice flat. Make sure the cattle haven't drifted. Colt, I need to work, Alara. Just let me work. He saddled his horse and rode out before she could argue, leaving her standing alone in the yard with the devastating knowledge that they had 4 weeks to perform a miracle. She went inside and started breakfast mechanically, her mind racing. There had to be a solution, had to be something they could do, sell cattle, but the market was terrible and they didn't have enough healthy stock to make the money they needed. Borrow from neighbors, but everyone was struggling. Take Henderson's offer, but that would destroy Colt, and she wouldn't do it. The hands came in for breakfast, and she could tell from their faces that they'd heard. Jack especially looked grim. We'll figure something out, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Always do. But as the day wore on and Colt didn't return, Alara felt hope slipping away. She cleaned obsessively, scrubbing floors that were already clean, reorganizing shelves that didn't need it. Anything to keep moving, to avoid thinking about losing this place, this life they'd barely started building. It was late afternoon when Dorothy arrived, Tom with her. They'd clearly heard the news. Bad news traveled faster than good in ranch country. How is he? Dorothy asked, settling at the kitchen table. I don't know. He rode out this morning and hasn't come back. Alara set coffee in front of them with shaking hands. I don't know what to do. Not much you can do, Tom said quietly. Bank wants its money, and either you have it or you don't. There has to be something. We can't just give up. Dorothy reached across the table and took Alara's hand. Honey, sometimes fighting means knowing when to walk away. Colt could take Pritchard's offer for the land. It's not what he wants, but it would pay off the debt and give him a fresh start. It would kill him. Alara pulled her hand back. This ranch is everything to him. His parents' legacy. Giving it to someone like Pritchard. He'd never forgive himself. Better that than losing everything anyway and having nothing to show for it. No. Alara stood pacing. There has to be another way. We just have to find it. But as the words left her mouth, she knew how desperate they sounded. Wishes weren't solutions. Hope didn't pay debts. Colt finally returned after dark, his face drawn with exhaustion. He barely touched the dinner she'd kept warm for him, just pushed food around his plate until she finally took it away. Talk to me, she said, sitting across from him. Nothing to talk about. The numbers don't work. They haven't worked for years. I've been fooling myself thinking I could turn it around. He looked up at her, and the defeat in his eyes was worse than anger would have been. My father built this place from nothing, and I'm the one who's going to lose it. Hell of a legacy. You haven't lost it yet. 30 days, Alara. Where am I supposed to find that kind of money in 30 days? She didn't have an answer. Neither of them did. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of impossible circumstances pressing down on them. Finally, Colt stood. I'm going to bed. Long day tomorrow. Colt, please. I can't talk about this anymore tonight. He left, and Alara sat alone in the kitchen as the lamp oil burned low, trying to think of solutions that didn't exist. The next week was torture. Colt threw himself into work with manic intensity, pushing himself and the hands harder than ever. He was trying to outrun the inevitable, Alara realized. Trying to work so hard he didn't have to think about losing everything. She did what she could, kept the house running, kept everyone fed, tried to be a steady presence in the chaos. But she felt helpless, watching Colt slowly fracture under the pressure. It was Jack who finally cornered her one afternoon while Colt was out. He's going to work himself to death, the older man said bluntly. Someone needs to make him see reason. He won't listen to me. Then make him listen, because right now he's so focused on not failing his father that he can't see he's failing himself. Jack's expression softened. You're good for him, Miss Quinn. Better than he probably deserves. But he needs you to be strong now, even when he won't be. That night, Elara waited up for Colt. When he came in well after midnight, covered in dust and exhaustion, she was sitting at the kitchen table. You should be asleep, he said. So should you. But here we are. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. Elara, sit, Colt, please. He sat, wariness in every line of his body. You're killing yourself, she said without preamble. Working 20-hour days, barely eating, not sleeping, and for what? So you can say you fought until the last second? I'm trying to save the ranch. No, you're trying to punish yourself for something that isn't your fault. She leaned forward. The drought isn't your fault. The market crash isn't your fault. Your father's debts aren't your fault. But you're acting like if you just work hard enough, sacrifice enough, you can somehow go back and fix all of it. I have to try. Why? Why do you have to try the impossible? Her voice cracked. I'm watching you destroy yourself, and I won't just stand by and let it happen. Colt was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. Because if I don't try, what was it all for? What did my father die for? What did my mother believe in? If I just give up and let it all go, then you're free. The words came out softer than she'd intended. Free to build something new instead of drowning in the past. You don't understand, don't I? She stood, moving around the table to kneel beside his chair. I spent 23 years trying to be enough for people who would never see me as enough. Trying to fix something that was never actually broken. Me. And you know what finally changed? I stopped trying to meet impossible standards and started building something real. She took his hands. This ranch, your parents' dream, it's beautiful. Worth fighting for. But it's not worth dying for. And if you can't save it, that doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human. Colt pulled her up and into his lap, burying his face in her shoulder. She felt dampness against her neck and realized he was crying, silent, shaking sobs that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. She held him while he broke apart, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure either of them believed, that it would be okay, that they'd figure it out, that failure wasn't the end of the world. Eventually the tears stopped. Colt pulled back, wiping his face roughly. Sorry. That was human, Elara interrupted. That was human. He managed a weak smile. Yeah, I guess it was. They sat there for a while, tangled together in the chair, neither speaking. Finally, Colt sighed. I don't know how to let go, he admitted. This place is all I've known since I was born. All I am. That's not true. You're more than this ranch. More than your parents' legacy. She touched his face. You're the man who gave me a chance when no one else would, who taught me to ride and trusted me with his home and saw me as more than just the help. That's who you are. Not the land or the cattle or the buildings, you. And if we lose all of it, what then? Then we start over. Together. She said it with more confidence than she felt, but she meant every word. We'll find another ranch, or we'll move to town, or we'll go somewhere entirely new. As long as we're together, we can build something worth having. Colt studied her face like he was memorizing it. You really mean that. I really mean that. He kissed her then, gentle and desperate, and full of things neither of them had said out loud yet. When they finally pulled apart, something had shifted between them. An understanding, maybe, or a decision. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, we'll figure it out. Together. It wasn't a solution, wasn't even a plan, but it was a start. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Colt sold what cattle he could at prices that made Elara wince. They cut expenses to the bone. Tom Brennan organized a collection among the neighboring ranchers, a gesture of solidarity that brought in enough to make a dent but not solve the problem. They were still short. Even with everything they'd scraped together, they were thousands of dollars short. 3 days before the deadline, Elara was hanging laundry when she saw a rider approaching. Her heart sank, expecting another creditor or bearer of bad news. Instead, it was a young man she didn't recognize, carrying a leather satchel. Miss Quinn, he called, I have a delivery for you. She walked over, confused. I'm not expecting anything. It's from a Mr. Tobias Quinn in Boston. He handed her the satchel. Said it was urgent. Tobias. Alara's hands shook as she opened the satchel. Inside was a bundle of bills and a letter in her brother's handwriting. Alara, I know you said sorry doesn't fix what was broken. You were right. But maybe this can help fix something that still matters. This is everything I've saved since I started working. Every penny I didn't spend on drink or cards or any of the other ways I used to waste my life. It's not much, maybe a quarter of what you need, but it's yours. No strings, no expectations. I can't take back sending you away. Can't undo the years I failed you as a brother. But I can help you keep the life you've built, since I'm the reason you ended up there in the first place. Use it for the ranch, for yourself, for whatever future you're building with Mercer. You deserve to choose your own path, and if this helps you do that, then maybe I finally did something right. I'm sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have, along with this money and the hope that someday you might forgive me. Your brother, Tobias Alara, read the letter twice, tears blurring the words. Then she ran to find Colt. He was in the barn, mending tack. When she burst in, breathless and crying, he dropped everything. What happened? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. She thrust the satchel at him. Tobias sent money. It's not everything we need, but it might be enough to convince the bank to extend the loan. Give us more time. Colt counted the bills, his expression shifting from shock to cautious hope. This is a lot. Why would he? Because he's trying to make amends, because despite everything, he's still my brother. She wiped her eyes. And because maybe people can change if they want to badly enough. That evening, they sat down with the books and did the math. Tobias's money, combined with what they'd already raised, was still short of the full amount. But it was enough for a significant payment, enough to show the bank they were serious, that they could make this work with more time. It's a gamble, Colt said. Sullivan might say no anyway. But he might say yes. Alara gripped his hand. It's a chance. That's more than we had yesterday. The next morning, they rode into town together. The bank was a modest building on the main street, and Mr. Sullivan looked surprised to see them. Mr. Mercer, Miss Quinn, I wasn't expecting you until the deadline. We'd like to propose a payment plan, Colt said, laying out what they'd brought. This covers roughly 2/3 of what's owed. We can have the rest within 6 months if you'll grant an extension. Sullivan examined the money, then the papers Colt had prepared showing projected income from cattle sales, from hiring out the hands for seasonal work at neighboring ranches, from economies they could make. 6 months is a long time, Sullivan said finally. It is, but we've shown we can make the payments when we have time to work with. The drought just hit us harder than expected. Colt's voice was steady, but Alara could see the tension in his shoulders. We're asking for a chance. That's all. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'll need to discuss this with the bank president, but provisionally, yes. If you can maintain monthly payments and have the balance cleared in 6 months, we can work with that. The relief that flooded through Alara was so intense she felt dizzy. Colt's hand found hers under the table, squeezing hard enough to hurt. Thank you, he said. You won't regret this. See that I don't, Mr. Mercer? Outside in the bright morning sunshine, Colt pulled Alara into a fierce embrace. We did it, he said against her hair. We actually did it. We got a chance, she corrected. Now we have to make it work. We will. He pulled back to look at her. We will, because we're doing it together. That night, Alara wrote a letter to Tobias. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, gratitude, a door left open for the possibility of reconciliation someday. And as she sealed the envelope, she realized that she'd finally let go of the anger she'd been carrying for so long. Not because Tobias deserved it, but because she deserved the freedom of moving forward without it. 3 days later, Colt found her in the kitchen after dinner and led her outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that made the prairie look almost beautiful despite the drought damage. I want to show you something, he said, leading her to the fence overlooking the main pasture. What am I looking at? The future. He turned to face her, suddenly serious. Alara, I know we've only known each other a few months, I know this started as a business arrangement and everything's been complicated and messy, but somewhere in all that chaos, you became the most important thing in my life." Her heart was suddenly beating very fast. "I'm not good with words," he continued. "I'm better with actions. So I'm asking you, will you marry me? Will you stay here not as my housekeeper, but as my wife? Will you help me build something that's ours instead of just mine?" For a moment, Alara couldn't speak. Marriage. A permanent choice. A future built on more than just survival. "Yes," she said, the word coming out choked with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her as the sun sank below the horizon, and Alara thought about how far she'd come from that frightened woman on a stagecoach, convinced she was heading toward another form of captivity. She'd been wrong. She'd been heading toward freedom all along. Freedom to choose, freedom to build, freedom to love and be loved in return. The ranch was still struggling. The drought hadn't broken. The next 6 months would be brutal, fighting to make every payment and keep their heads above water. But they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. They were married 3 weeks later in the front room of the ranch house, with Dorothy and Tom as witnesses and the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through the territory. It wasn't the wedding Alara had imagined as a girl. No fancy dress, no church full of well-wishers, no elaborate celebration. Just a simple ceremony in a room she'd scrubbed clean with her own hands, promising her life to a man who'd seen her as valuable when the rest of the world had deemed her worthless. Colt wore his Sunday best, which meant clothes without holes and boots he'd actually polished. Alara wore the blue dress Dorothy had helped her alter, with wildflowers from the prairie tucked into her hair because they couldn't afford anything fancier. When the preacher pronounced them married and Colt kissed her, gentle and sure, Alara felt something shift deep inside her chest. She was Alara Mercer now. Not Quinn anymore. Not the unwanted burden or the plain girl nobody chose. She was a wife, a partner, someone who belonged. The Hands, Jack, Marcus, and Pete, had pooled their money to buy a bottle of decent whiskey, and they all toasted the newlyweds with rough affection. Dorothy cried and pretended she wasn't. Tom gave Colt a meaningful handshake and told him he'd better treat his wife right, or answer to every rancher in the territory. It was simple and imperfect and exactly right. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Colt carried Alara upstairs despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of walking. "Let me have this," he said. "I don't get to do romantic gestures very often." "You proposed at sunset. That was fairly romantic." "That was practical. I wanted good light so you could see I was serious." She laughed against his shoulder, and he set her down carefully once they reached the bedroom. Their bedroom now, not just his. She'd moved her things in that morning, her few possessions looking small and lost among his sparse furniture. They were both nervous, fumbling through intimacy like teenagers despite being grown adults. But there was tenderness in the awkwardness, humor in the fumbling. And afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled like sage in summer, Alara felt more at peace than she ever had in her life. "I love you," Colt said into the darkness. "I don't think I've said that yet, but I do. Have for a while now." "I love you too." The words came easily, naturally. "Even when you're being stubborn about resting. Especially then, I hope. Especially then." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and when Alara woke before dawn to start breakfast, Colt pulled her back down. "The Hands can wait one morning," he murmured. "Stay." So she did, and they watched the sunrise through the window together, the sky turning from black to gray to gold. The beginning of their first full day as husband and wife, and the continuation of the fight to save the ranch they now truly shared. The next 6 months were brutal. Making the monthly payments to the bank meant operating on the thinnest possible margins, with no room for error or bad luck. They got both anyway. In September, 3 of their best cattle died from some illness the vet couldn't identify. In October, the roof on the barn partially collapsed during a rare rainstorm, requiring repairs they could barely afford. In November, Marcus announced he'd gotten an offer from a ranch in Wyoming with better pay, and though they hated to lose him, they couldn't match the wages. But there were victories too, small and hard-won. The drought finally broke in late September, rain coming in torrents that turned the parched prairie green almost overnight. Cattle prices ticked upward as winter approached and demand increased. Pete, despite his youth, proved himself capable of doing the work of 2 men when needed. and Alara discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks before she was certain, but when she finally told Colt, his reaction made the anxiety worth it. He'd been fixing fence when she rode out to find him, and she delivered the news without preamble. "I'm going to have a baby." He dropped the wire cutters, just stood there staring at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "Colt, did you hear me? A baby." He said it slowly, testing the words, then, "We're having a baby?" "Yes, probably around June if I'm counting right." He crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her off the horse, carefully, like she was made of glass, then spun her around despite her shrieking protests. "We're having a baby!" He was grinning, that rare full smile that transformed his entire face. "We're going to be parents." "Well, I am definitely going to be a parent," Alara said, laughing. "You're going to be sleep-deprived and wondering what you've gotten yourself into. I already wonder that every day. This just makes it official." The joy on his face made her forget, temporarily, about the financial pressures still hanging over them. Made her believe that maybe, just maybe, they really would make it through. December brought the hardest test yet. A late blizzard swept through, catching them unprepared and killing 6 head of cattle they couldn't afford to lose. The bank payment was due in 2 weeks, and they were short. Again. Alara sat at the kitchen table running numbers for the 3rd time, hoping the mathematics would somehow change. They didn't. "We could sell the breeding stock," she said when Colt came in from checking on the animals. "The 3 heifers we were saving for spring. That's our future herd. We sell them. We're mortgaging next year to pay for this one." "And if we don't make the payment?" He didn't answer, just stood by the stove warming his hands, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Alara set down her pencil. "We could ask Henderson for a loan." "Absolutely not." "Colt," I said no. That vulture would own us, and you know it. The interest he'd charge, we'd never get out from under it. Then what? We're short, and we're running out of options. The silence stretched between them, heavy with fear and frustration. Finally, Colt sat down across from her. "There's one thing we haven't tried." "What?" "Asking for help, real help, from people who actually care." He ran a hand through his hair. "Dorothy mentioned once that the Ranchers Association has a fund for members in temporary hardship. It's not charity, you pay it back with small interest, but it's designed for situations like this." Alara remembered Henderson's gathering, the way the community had rallied with small donations. "You think they'd help?" "I think they might, if we ask." It went against everything in Colt's nature to ask for help, to admit he couldn't handle things alone. Alara reached across the table and took his hand. "Then we ask. Together." The meeting was held at the Brennan Ranch, with representatives from every spread in the territory. Alara sat beside Colt, her hand in his, as he laid out their situation with painful honesty. The debt, the setbacks, the progress they'd made, and the obstacles that remained. "I'm not asking for a handout," he finished. "I'm asking for a bridge loan to get us through until spring. We'll pay it back with interest. You have my word." Henderson predictably scoffed. "Your word? The same word that promised you'd turn that ranch around? Forgive me if I'm not convinced." But Tom Brennan stood up. "I've known the Mercer family for 20 years. Colt's father was as honest a man as I ever met, and his son is the same. If Colt says he'll pay it back, he will." Others chimed in. A rancher named Williams spoke about how Colt had helped him round up strayed cattle last spring, refusing payment. Another mentioned the time Colt had ridden through a storm to warn everyone about a creek about to flood. The community remembered, and in the end, they voted to extend the loan. Henderson voted against it, naturally, but he was outnumbered. When it was done, Colt's hands were shaking as he signed the papers. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "All of you. I won't forget this." Outside, in the cold December air, Alara wrapped her arms around him. "That was hard for you," she said. "Hardest thing I've ever done." He held her close, mindful of the small life growing between them. "But you were right. We can't do this alone. I've been trying to for years, and it nearly destroyed everything. We're stronger together." "Yeah, we are." They made the payment with 2 days to spare. And when spring came, bringing with it the promise of new calves and higher prices, they started to believe they might actually survive this. The baby arrived in early June during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made the horses nervous in the barn. Dorothy served as midwife, her capable hands guiding Alara through hours of labor that left her sweating and exhausted and absolutely certain she was going to die. "You're not dying," Dorothy said firmly. "You're just having a baby. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Well, they're all insane," Alara gasped between contractions. But when the baby finally came, a girl, red-faced and screaming with impressive lung power, Alara forgot about the pain. Forgot about everything except the tiny, perfect person Dorothy placed in her arms. Colt, who'd been banished to the kitchen during the worst of it, came upstairs at Dorothy's call. He stopped in the doorway, staring at his wife and daughter like they were a miracle he couldn't quite believe in. "Come meet her," Alara said softly. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and when he took the baby in his large, work-roughened hands, Alara saw tears tracking down his face. "She's so small," he whispered. "She's perfect." Yeah, she is." He looked at Alara. "What should we name her?" They'd discussed options for months, but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her daughter's face, Alara knew. "Sarah, after your mother." Colt's breath caught. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Sarah Mercer. A new beginning for the family." He bent down and kissed her, careful not to jostle the baby. "I love you, both of you, so much." "We love you too." Dorothy cleared her throat from the doorway. "I'll give you three some privacy, but Alara, you need to rest. And Colt, there are 3 ranch hands downstairs who want to know if they have a new boss to report to in about 20 years. Tell them they've got a long wait," Colt said, not taking his eyes off his daughter. After Dorothy left, they sat together in the afternoon light. Colt on the edge of the bed, Alara propped up against pillows, Sarah sleeping between them. Outside, the storm was passing, leaving everything washed clean and new. "We made it," Alara said quietly. "We're still making it, still fighting." "I know, but we're winning." She looked around the room, the clean walls she'd scrubbed, the furniture they'd repaired together, the home they'd built from ruins. "We're actually winning." The final bank payment came due in August, and they made it with 3 weeks to spare. Cattle sales had been good, the spring calves healthy, the summer growth better than it had been in years. They'd even managed to hire back another hand to replace Marcus. When Colt returned from town with the paid-in-full notice from the bank, he found Alara in the kitchen making dinner with Sarah strapped to her chest in a sling Dorothy had made. "It's done," he said, holding up the paper. "The ranch is ours, free and clear." Alara set down the spoon she'd been stirring with and took the paper, reading it twice to make sure she understood. "We did it. We did it." They stood in the kitchen they'd reclaimed together, their daughter between them, and let the reality sink in. They'd saved the ranch, against impossible odds, through drought and debt, and every setback the territory could throw at them. They'd survived. More than survived. They'd built something real. That night, after Sarah was asleep in the cradle Colt had built with his own hands, they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars Alara had seen that first night, when she'd felt so alone and frightened and certain she was heading toward another form of captivity. "What are you thinking?" Colt asked. "About how wrong I was. That first night, when I arrived here." She leaned against his shoulder. "I thought this was the end of everything. Turns out it was the beginning." "The beginning of what?" "Of me. Of us. Of actually living instead of just surviving." She turned to look at him. "I spent 23 years being told I wasn't enough, that I was the problem, but I wasn't. The world just failed to see me. Until you learned to see yourself," Colt finished. "No, until you saw me first." She took his hand. "You gave me a chance when I had no reason to expect one. Treated me like I mattered before I believed it myself. That changed everything. I was just desperate for a housekeeper. You were desperate for help. But you gave me respect, purpose, a place where my worth wasn't tied to my appearance or my marriage prospects or anyone else's expectations." She squeezed his hand. "You saw me as valuable when everyone else saw me as disposable. Do you understand what a gift that was?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "You saved me too, you know. This ranch, it was killing me. The debt, the pressure, the weight of living up to ghosts. I was so focused on not failing my father that I couldn't see I was failing myself. And now? Now I'm building something for Sarah, for you, for the future instead of the past." He pulled Alara closer. My father would have liked you. My mother too. They would have seen what I see, someone who makes hard things possible just by refusing to quit. They sat in comfortable silence as full dark settled over the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. In the barn, horses shifted and settled. Inside the house, their daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the struggles that had preceded her arrival or the love that had built the home she'd inherit. What happens now? Alara asked. We've saved the ranch, made the final payment. What's next? We live, Colt said simply. We raise our daughter. We work the land. We build a life that's ours instead of trying to live up to anyone's legacy or expectations. Just that simple? Just that simple. He tilted her chin up to look at him. No more fighting to survive. No more barely holding on. We've earned the right to actually enjoy what we've built. I like the sound of that. So do I. The years that followed proved him right. They weren't easy. Ranching never was. But the desperate edge was gone. They expanded slowly, carefully, hiring more hands as they could afford them. They paid back the Ranchers Association loan early, with interest. They helped their neighbors the way their neighbors had helped them, understanding now that strength came from community, not isolation. Sarah grew into a wild, fearless child who followed her father around the ranch like a shadow and argued with her mother about everything from bedtimes to vegetables. She had Colt's stubbornness and Alara's practicality, and she was absolutely certain she would run the ranch herself someday. Let her, Alara told Colt when he worried about his daughter's headstrong nature. Let her believe she can do anything. She'll probably prove us all right. 2 years after Sarah, they had a son, James, named for Colt's father. He was quieter than his sister, thoughtful where she was impulsive, but just as determined in his own way. Tobias visited once, when Sarah was 3. He was still sober, still working the docks, still trying to build a life he didn't have to be ashamed of. The visit was awkward and stilted, full of careful conversation and unspoken history. But when he left, he hugged Alara tight. You were right to stay, he said. This is where you belong. I know. And I'm proud of you for building this, for being happy. Thank you for making it possible. The money? We wouldn't have made it without it. Then I finally did something right as your brother. He managed to smile. Maybe someday we'll figure out how to be family again. Maybe, Alara agreed, but this is enough for now. She watched him ride away and realized she'd forgiven him. Not because he deserved it, necessarily, but because holding on to anger had become more exhausting than letting it go. The ranch thrived. Not spectacularly, they'd never be as wealthy as Henderson or some of the other spreads, but they were successful by the measures that mattered. The land was healthy, the cattle were strong, the family was fed and clothed and safe, and Alara was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy, in a way she'd never imagined possible when she was that plain girl in Boston being told she was a burden. One evening, when Sarah was 7 and James was 5, the whole family sat on the porch watching the sunset. The children were arguing about something inconsequential. Colt was whittling, his hands never entirely idle, even in rest. Alara was mending a shirt that James had torn climbing trees despite repeated warnings. It was completely ordinary, totally unremarkable, the kind of evening that happened thousands of times in thousands of homes across the country. And it was perfect. Sarah noticed her mother watching and tugged on her sleeve. Mama, what are you smiling about? Just thinking about how lucky I am. Lucky how? Lucky to be here, with all of you, living this life. But you work all the time, Sarah said with a child's brutal honesty. How is that lucky? Alara pulled her daughter onto her lap, breathing in the smell of sunshine and dirt and pure childhood. Because I'm working for something that matters, building something that's mine, ours. That's not work. That's living. Colt caught her eye over the children's heads and smiled. The scar above his eye, the one she'd stitched that first time, had faded to a thin white line, a reminder of where they'd started and everything they'd survived to get here. Later, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Colt found Alara in the kitchen going over the books. They were in the black now, comfortably so, but old habits died hard. Come to bed, he said. In a minute. I just want to... Come to bed, Alara. She set down her pencil and let him pull her to her feet. They walked upstairs together, checking on the children out of habit. Sarah sprawled across her bed like a starfish. James curled up tight with his favorite carved horse. In their room, Colt pulled her close. You know what I realized today? What? I can't remember what this place looked like before you. The house, I mean. I know it was a mess, but I can't actually picture it. All I see is how it is now. Clean? Home. He kissed her forehead. You made it a home, made me into someone who knows how to have one. We made it together. Yeah, together. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the way they had every night since they'd married. And if Alara dreamed, it was of wide-open spaces and endless sky, of children's laughter and her husband's rare smile, of a life built from nothing but stubbornness and hope and the revolutionary act of being seen. Years later, when Sarah was grown and running the ranch with the same fierce determination her parents had shown, she asked her mother about those early days. Were you scared, she asked, when you first came here? Terrified, Alara admitted. They were sitting on that same porch, watching Sarah's own children play in the yard. I thought I was being sent into exile, thought my life was over. But it wasn't. No, it was just beginning. I just didn't know it yet. What changed? Alara thought about it. About the girl who'd arrived with a small trunk and no choices, certain she'd never be enough for anyone. About the woman who'd learned that enough was something you decided for yourself, not something others determined for you. I stopped waiting for the world to see my worth, she said finally, and started building a life that proved it. Not to anyone else, to myself. That's it? That's everything. Alara smiled at her daughter. The world will tell you all kinds of things about who you are and what you're worth. Most of it will be wrong. The only opinion that matters is your own, and sometimes you need someone else to believe in you first before you can believe in yourself. Like Papa believed in you. Like your father saw me when I couldn't see myself, and gave me the space to become who I was always supposed to be. Sarah was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then, I'm glad you stayed, even though you were scared. Even though it was hard. So am I, sweetheart. So am I. Because in the end, that was the truth Alara had learned in her years at Red Hollow Ranch. The things worth having were usually the things that scared you most. The life you were meant to live was usually the one you couldn't imagine when you started. And the person you were supposed to be was often hiding underneath all the labels and limitations other people had placed on you, waiting for the chance to emerge. All you had to do was refuse to quit. Refuse to accept that you were less than you were. Refuse to believe that the hand you were dealt was the only one you could play. All you had to do was keep going, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. And someday, if you were lucky, you'd look around and realize you'd built something real. Something yours. Something that couldn't be taken away because you'd created it with your own hands and your own heart and your own stubborn refusal to give up. Alara Quinn had arrived at Red Hollow Ranch as an unwanted housekeeper, traded to settle someone else's debt. She'd become Alara Mercer, wife, mother, rancher, and the woman who'd proven that your worth wasn't determined by how others saw you, but by how you saw yourself. And that made all the difference. The sun set over the prairie one more time, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, and Alara watched it from the porch of the home she'd built, surrounded by the family she'd created. Living the life she'd chosen. She'd been right, that first night when she'd decided to survive on her own terms. This was her exile, her prison, her punishment. It was also her salvation, her freedom, and the greatest gift she'd ever been given. Sometimes the thing you feared most turned out to be exactly what you needed. And sometimes, when you stopped running from the hard things and started building with them instead, you discovered that you'd been strong enough all along. You just needed the chance to prove it.